Every belief system creates spaces where the sacred becomes visible. Sometimes these spaces take the form of grand temples, filled with wealth, ornament, and carefully designed architecture. In other cases, they remain simple, marked not by walls or columns, but by offerings left behind, objects that carry meaning rather than material value. Yet regardless of form, one element is always present, a focal point where ritual happens, where the unseen is approached through symbols, objects, and repeated acts. These sacred centres might hold finely crafted statues of gods, or nothing more than an unshaped stone believed to carry divine presence. What matters is not the structure itself, but the role it plays as a bridge between the human and the sacred. Before examining individual Celtic cults, it is essential to understand the environments in which these rituals took place. Worship did not depend entirely on constructed temples. Natural landscapes often carried just as much, if not more, religious significance. Sacred groves, rivers, springs, and open enclosures functioned as ritual spaces, sometimes without any permanent architecture. In these places, religious authority rested not only in location but also in those who interpreted the rites. Among the Celts, this role belonged to a specialised priesthood, often identified with the Druids. Their authority extended beyond ritual performance. They regulated participation itself. Those who defied their rulings could be excluded from sacrifices, a punishment severe enough to isolate individuals completely from society. Religion, in this sense, was inseparable from social order. Water, above all, stood at the centre of Celtic religious life. Springs, wells, and rivers were not merely physical features but living forces tied to fertility, renewal, and power. Rivers were often associated with divine beings, especially mother goddesses whose identities merged with the flowing water itself. These deities embodied both creation and destruction, reflecting the dual nature of water, capable of sustaining life or overwhelming it. In some regions, entire rivers carried the names of such divine figures, suggesting that the landscape itself was seen as a manifestation of the sacred. At the sources of these rivers, temples or ritual sites were sometimes established, emphasizing the origin point as especially powerful. In Gaul, clear evidence shows that certain springs were treated as sacred centres. Temples built at these locations honoured the deity believed to inhabit the source. Artistic representations discovered at these sites depict goddesses connected directly to water, sometimes shown travelling in symbolic vessels or surrounded by imagery that reinforces their connection to fertility and the natural cycle. These sacred locations were not chosen randomly. They emerged from the belief that divine presence was strongest, where water first emerged from the earth. In Britain and Ireland, although the evidence is less direct, a similar pattern appears. Many rivers bear names that point to divine origins, and mythological traditions explain their creation through stories of powerful female figures. These narratives often describe a sacred well or spring whose force, once disturbed, transforms into a river, carrying both the memory and identity of the goddess. Such stories reflect a deep connection between myth and geography, where natural features are understood through sacred storytelling. Ritual activity frequently centered on water itself. Offerings were placed into rivers, lakes, and wells not as random acts but as deliberate gestures meant to reach the divine. Weapons, tools, jewellery, and even food were cast into water as gifts, suggesting that these places were seen as gateways to another realm. Archaeological discoveries across Europe reveal large deposits of valuable objects submerged in lakes and rivers. These were not accidental losses. Their careful placement indicates intentional sacrifice. The act of giving something valuable to the water symbolized communication with forces beyond the visible world. Lakes and pools also played an important role in ritual practice. In some cases, wooden platforms were constructed to facilitate the deposition of offerings. Historical accounts describe large quantities of treasure thrown into sacred lakes, sometimes with the belief that disturbing these deposits would bring disaster. This idea highlights the perceived sanctity of these waters and the fear associated with violating them. Even in later periods, echoes of these traditions can be seen in local customs, where people continue to leave offerings in water believed to have healing or protective powers. Wells, in particular, held a unique position within this system. Unlike rivers or lakes, they were often seen as direct openings into the other world. Objects placed into wells carried symbolic weight, representing a connection between the surface world and a hidden realm below. Excavations of ancient wells reveal layers of deposits, including pottery, coins, tools, and animal remains. Some wells also contained carefully arranged objects, suggesting repeated and structured ritual use over long periods of time. In certain cases, wells were integrated into built structures, becoming the central feature of a temple. These sites combine natural and constructed elements, reinforcing the idea that sacred power originated from the landscape itself, but could be framed and intensified through architecture. Large numbers of offerings recovered from such locations indicate sustained and organized worship. The presence of altars and inscriptions further suggests that these sites were not isolated, but formed part of a wider religious network. Another striking feature of Celtic ritual practice is the use of deep shafts and pits. These structures, often extending far below ground level, appear to have served a similar purpose to wells. Their contents include a mixture of everyday objects and items of clear ritual significance, such as human remains, animal bones, and carefully placed artifacts. In some instances, traces of organic materials suggest that offerings involving food or sacrifice were also part of these rituals. The depth of these shafts reinforces the idea of descent, of reaching toward a hidden world beneath the surface. Across all these practices, a consistent theme emerges. The sacred is not confined to temples or buildings, but is deeply embedded in the natural world. Water, in its various forms, acts as both a symbol and a medium, linking human activity with divine presence. The Celts did not separate religion from their environment. Instead, they experienced the landscape itself as alive with meaning. Through offerings, rituals, and the careful selection of sacred sites, they created a system of belief that was both deeply rooted in nature and structured by tradition. Over time, especially under Roman influence, more formal temples began to appear, often built over earlier sacred locations. These structures introduced new architectural styles and combined local deities with those of the wider Roman world. Yet even within these more elaborate settings, the importance of water and natural features remained central. Springs continued to attract worshippers, and the blending of traditions shows how adaptable these beliefs were. Rather than replacing older practices, new influences were absorbed into an existing framework. Another major centre of sacred water worship appeared at Buxton in Derbyshire, where hot springs were linked to a native goddess, and remained an important destination even after Roman influence spread across Britain. The waters gathered in the valley floor, where different types of springs rose close to one another, giving the place an unusual and powerful character. A similar pattern can be seen farther north in Yorkshire, where a spring at Well became the heart of local devotion during the Roman period, even though the name of the divine force honoured there has not survived. Across northern Britain, the religious role of springs and wells is visible again and again. The cult of Coventina at Carrowborough is one of the clearest examples, but it was not unique. Reliefs of water nymphs found at High Rochester and dedications to local female powers such as Lattice in Cumbria, show that springs, marshes, pools, and moving water continued to be treated as sacred presences. At Chester too, inscriptions reveal that local springs and their spirits were objects of reverence, suggesting that the religious importance of water remained deeply rooted even under Roman rule. A wide range of ritual objects recovered from wells also points to the habit of making offerings directly into water. In Scotland, cauldrons and metal objects have been found in watery settings, while other discoveries include the remains of decorated horse gear and horned pieces that appear to have been placed in marshy or wet ground for symbolic reasons rather than discarded by accident. Customs surrounding healing wells and sacred springs survived long after pagan religion faded, which hints at how deeply respected these places once were. Their later reputation for blessing, danger, or healing was not created out of nowhere. It was the fading echo of a much older sacred tradition. One remarkable object from a Roman well near Winterbourne, Kingston in Dorset, helps illuminate this world. It was a small strip of thin bronze bearing the image of a hare, an animal that carried clear symbolic weight in Celtic belief. The strip also carried a pair of signs that seemed to belong to a ritual or sacred context. Other bronze fragments from the same well suggest that the place was more than a simple water source. Nearby, a curious arrangement of burnt tiles placed upright at even intervals appears to have marked out a ceremonial feature, and beside it lay a small stone and an iron knife. Close to the well, an oblong pit filled with ash, pottery, flint, and traces of burning suggests repeated ritual activity. This was not an ordinary domestic space. It was a place where offerings were made and where fire and water likely worked together in acts of devotion. There are also hints in insular tradition that a well could be so powerful or so dangerous that it needed to be enclosed within a special structure. One Irish tale speaks of a hero building a house over a well made dangerous by severed heads cast into it. The water in the story becomes threatening and violent, as though charged by the power of death itself. Whether this preserves a distant memory of actual shrines built around sacred wells cannot be proven, but the idea is striking. It matches the archaeological reality that in some places a spring or well stood at the very centre of a sanctuary. Roman religion, with its strong cult of healing springs and water spirits, found it easy to merge with native traditions in this area. Because of that, sacred waters became one of the clearest meeting points between Roman and Celtic belief. Whether enclosed by masonry, timber, wickerwork, or left open beneath the sky, springs, wells, pools, and river sources were among the most honoured ritual places in the Celtic world. They were not temples in the formal Mediterranean sense, yet they served as holy centres where people approached divine power in a direct and visible form. Trees and groves occupied a similarly important place in Celtic religion. Certain trees were not merely admired but treated with reverence, and sacred groves seem to have been closely linked to priestly activity. The Druids in particular were strongly associated with the oak, a tree that later writers describe as holding exceptional dignity in Celtic ritual life. The oak was more than a plant. It stood as a living pillar of divine force, a symbol of strength, endurance, and authority. Wooden funerary structures from early Celtic Europe may hint at this same respect, though their practical function makes certainty difficult. More persuasive are graves in which oak branches and other carefully chosen vegetation were deliberately included, suggesting that the wood itself possessed sacred value. Even posts erected in ritual shafts may have retained the spiritual force of the trees from which they were cut. Insular tradition preserves the memory of several famous sacred trees, each surrounded by an aura of taboo and wonder. Some, stood on open plains and were treated almost as living monuments. Assemblies were held beneath them, laws may have been proclaimed near them, and harming them was considered a serious offence. A sacred tree was not simply part of the landscape. It could embody the fortune and identity of a people. In some stories, a mighty tree cannot be burned or destroyed by ordinary means. In others, a transformed hero takes refuge in its branches, merging human fate with the sacred power of wood and leaf. These traditions suggest that the holy tree was imagined not only as a meeting point between earth and sky, but also as a link between life, death, kingship, and the other world. The importance of trees also appears in names, images, and ritual art. Personal names linked to oak, yew, holly, hazel, and woodland are found across Celtic regions, showing that trees were woven into identity itself. Divine figures are often shown wearing leaf crowns or emerging from foliage, as if they belonged partly to the living world of the forest. In Gaul, some deities seem especially tied to trees, and certain altars depict either a single important tree or a god whose presence is inseparable from one. One famous scene on a great silver cauldron shows warriors carrying a tree, suggesting that even in ritual procession, the tree could function as a sacred emblem. These images do not reflect decoration alone. They point to a religious mindset in which the divine could dwell in timber, branch, or grove as naturally as in carved stone. Place names provide further evidence. Across the Celtic world, names containing the word for sacred grove appear again and again, from Gaul to Britain and even into Asia Minor. Some clearly refer to wooded sanctuaries, while others may indicate enclosed holy places, where trees formed the central feature. Sacred groves were remembered as settings for rites, sacrifices, and prophetic acts. In one famous example, a British queen is said to have performed rituals to her goddess within such a grove. These wooded sanctuaries were not marginal spaces. They were active religious centres, tied to tribal identity and divine power. Literary tradition from Ireland and Wales adds another layer. Tales speak of supernatural women bearing names drawn from trees or fruit, and of lovers whose graves give rise to sacred growths in which their presence still lingers. Heroes seek marvellous branches, guarded fruits, and enchanted trees standing at the edges of the human world. Again and again, the tree appears as a keeper of mystery, fertility, beauty, and danger. It is clear that trees and groves ranked among the most important sacred spaces available to Celtic religion, whether or not a built shrine stood beside them. From this, a broader image of Celtic worship begins to emerge. Many sacred enclosures were likely centred on a revered tree, often close to a holy spring or well. Nearby there may have stood a modest shelter made from timber, wicker, or occasionally stone, built not as a monumental temple but as a place to store cult objects and images. Priests may have guarded these objects and brought them out during major seasonal gatherings, when the community assembled for rites tied to the land, the dead, and the gods. Burial places formed another vital category of sacred ground. Grave ritual naturally reflected beliefs about the next world, but burial mounds also became places of gathering, sacrifice, and memory. In Celtic thought, death was not an absolute end. It marked a passage into another state of being, and the mound of the dead could therefore become a point of contact between worlds. Great ceremonial centres in Ireland, such as Tara and Emain Macha, appear to have functioned not primarily as settlements, but as places for assembly, festival, and rite, bound up with ancestral burials and divine memory. In this sense, the grave mound stood beside the well and the sea as one of the known entrances to the otherworld. The great mounds of the Boyne, for example, were remembered not simply as tombs, but as the dwellings of supernatural beings. The later tradition of fairy mounds may preserve this older vision of burial places as houses of the divine dead. Some stories describe ritual acts performed in direct relation to these mounds. One tale tells of a craftsman whose anvil cast showers of water, fire, and shining gems toward a great burial place each night, as though the mound itself answered or attracted supernatural force. Such images make sense only in a culture where the grave of an ancestor, hero or god, retained sacred power. It becomes easy to imagine shrines built beside such mounds, and any great tree growing near them would almost certainly have shared in their sanctity. The Celtic world, then, was marked by many kinds of holy place. A sacred grove, a solitary tree, a healing spring, a dangerous well, a grave mound, or the supposed resting place of a divine ancestor could all become centres of ritual life. Many of these sites leave little architectural trace, which makes them easy to overlook. Yet small discoveries suggest that some sort of shelter often existed. A wooden idol found in western Scotland, accompanied by traces of wickerwork, hints that it once stood inside a light structure made of woven material. In later folk tradition, the memory of humble shrines survived in places where local communities continued unusual seasonal customs around simple buildings. Some rites involved the periodic renewal of a sacred roof, suggesting that maintenance of the shrine itself formed part of the ritual cycle. Archaeology has also revealed enclosed sanctuaries that help clarify the appearance of early Celtic ritual sites. In parts of Central Europe, ditched enclosures with pits, posts, animal remains, and occasionally human bones point to formal areas set aside for sacrifice and worship. One especially striking site contained a tall stone pillar, a paved surface that may have served as an altar, traces of wooden posts, animal burials, and the grave of a woman placed within the enclosure. Such a place was not domestic. It was carefully arranged for sacred action, perhaps combining sacrifice, burial, and ceremonial display. Similar sites elsewhere show that pits, posts, ditches, and enclosed grounds were likely common elements of cult space in the pre-Roman Celtic world. Other sanctuaries were simpler but no less important. Circular post-built structures from the late Iron Age may have carried conical roofs and served as shrines. Elsewhere, ditched burial enclosures seem to have remained sacred for generations, and may even have sheltered cult images or sacred posts. One great circular earthwork in western Germany, with a central post hole and nearby burial mounds, may have been a major assembly place. It recalls the ceremonial landscapes of Ireland, where earthworks, ancestral mounds, and ritual gathering places formed a connected sacred geography. A few pre-Roman sanctuaries in southern Gaul were built in stone and show stronger Mediterranean influence than most Celtic shrines. Even so, the symbols found there belong unmistakably to the wider Celtic religious world. Severed heads, horses, birds, and other martial signs connect them with the warlike and ancestral traditions seen elsewhere. Later, Romano-Celtic temples in Britain may also have risen on much older sacred ground. Sites such as Lydney and Maiden Castle likely did not become holy only in late antiquity. Their Roman period temples probably formalised places already respected for centuries. In some cases, Roman coins and altars found near ancient barrows and earthworks suggest renewed interest in older native sacred centres, rather than entirely new foundations. Excavated sanctuaries in southern Britain support this idea. At Heathrow, archaeologists found evidence of a square wooden shrine from the Iron Age that seems to anticipate the later square temples of the Romano-Celtic world. At Frilford, a native shrine with large posts and ritual deposits was later dismantled and replaced by a Romanised structure, while the sanctity of the place itself endured. These discoveries are important because they show that pre-Roman Britain did possess built shrines, even if they were modest and easy to miss. For a long time, archaeology paid more attention to the dramatic stone remains of Roman religion than to the lighter timber structures of native cult. As a result, many early shrines were probably destroyed, ignored, or misunderstood. This brings the story into a later phase when temples and shrines began to appear under Roman influence. These buildings often borrowed Roman architectural forms, yet the gods worshipped inside them were frequently local, and many of the ritual objects remained unmistakably native in spirit. One important example comes from Worth in Kent, where a Romano-Celtic temple was built over an older sacred place already respected before the Roman period. Excavations there revealed fragments of a statue carrying a spear and shield, along with pottery from much earlier cultural phases and several miniature shields offered as votive gifts. The whole site suggests a sanctuary devoted to divine powers connected with warfare, even though no surviving inscription tells the god's name. The message is clear enough. Roman building methods may have altered the appearance of the shrine, but the heart of the cult remained rooted in older traditions. A similarly revealing site lies at Wooderton in Oxfordshire, where native and classical imagery existed side by side. The finds suggest that the sanctuary was more than a place of prayer. It may also have included workshops producing objects specifically intended for dedication. That detail matters because in Celtic society, religious festivals were not isolated from ordinary communal life. Gatherings at sacred centres often included exchange, display, and probably trade, and the very large number of coins found at Wooderton points to crowds and repeated visits. Many of the bronzes from the site have a strongly local character. A small male mask shows distinctly non-classical features, while a little figure of a goddess dressed in a short tunic carries the same native style. There are also fragments of bronze fittings with simplified human forms, their posture and anatomy expressed in a way that belongs far more to Celtic art than to Roman naturalism. Even pieces of chainmail appear to have been deposited there, not as lost equipment, but as ritual offerings. Altogether, the sanctuary seems to have attracted worshippers who dedicated objects linked to status, war, protection, and perhaps healing. The imagery from Wooderton becomes even more intriguing with the repeated appearance of birds, especially birds of prey. Eagles or hawks seem to have had particular meaning at the site, and when these are considered alongside the rings, pins, and bracelets also discovered there, another side of the cult begins to emerge. The sanctuary may have offered protection not only in war but also in health, perhaps especially in matters linked to women, fertility, and childbirth. The collection of objects is too varied to point to a single simple cult function. Model axes, a model anchor, and several miniature spears were also recovered. Some of the spears deliberately bent double before deposition. This intentional damaging of an offering is a familiar ritual act in Celtic religion. An object could be transformed before being given to the divine, symbolically taken out of human use and transferred into sacred possession. Other finds, including bronze letters, suggest that worshippers may even have been able to assemble their own dedications on site. Many of the ornaments themselves are cheaply made, looking more like objects created for ritual use than for daily wear. The chief deity of the sanctuary remains unnamed, but the surviving clues point toward a deeply local cult, preserved beneath a Romanized surface. Farley Heath in Surrey provides another important example. There, archaeologists uncovered the full plan of a Romano-Celtic temple along with its surrounding sacred enclosure. No definite evidence survived for an earlier Iron Age shrine beneath it, yet one object found there is especially striking. a decorated bronze strip believed to have come from the binding of a priestly staff or scepter. Its imagery is openly native in character. Gods and animals appear in a style that leaves little doubt that local symbolism still mattered profoundly. One of the divine figures shown on it seems to carry the attributes of a smith, which introduces another recurring theme in Celtic religion: the sacred importance of craft and metalworking. A similar bronze strip from a well in Dorset strengthens the impression that these fittings belonged either to ritual staffs or to sacred furniture used inside shrines. Such objects remind us that Romano-Celtic temples were not simply copies of Roman sanctuaries. They housed cult equipment shaped by local ideas and visual traditions. Other small bronze figures found in Britain probably once belonged to similar shrines. Among them are tiny horsemen, some helmeted and carrying shields, small enough either to serve as ritual attachments on poles or to act as offerings in their own right. Their scale suggests intimacy rather than monumentality. These were not public statues dominating a temple forecourt. They were personal, portable, and symbolic. Such finds echo ancient accounts that Celtic warriors carried standards in battle, and it is tempting to see in these miniatures a ritual link between sacred power and martial identity. The horsemen, like the shield and spear, belonged not only to war but to ceremonial display and divine protection. The temple at Harlow in Essex adds another layer to the picture. Here, there are signs that a sacred pool may once have formed part of the sanctuary itself, which would fit perfectly with the broader Celtic pattern of linking ritual space with water. An early coin found securely beneath the later temple level shows that the site had already held significance before the Romanized structure was erected. Its imagery is revealing: a male figure carrying a human head and either a club or scepter. Few images could more clearly express the persistence of native religious language beneath Roman forms. The severed head remained a potent symbol, and its presence on coinage, tied to a sanctuary, suggests that such beliefs still carried authority. Some shrines are known only through scattered finds. A brooch decorated with human heads from Gloucestershire may well have come from a cult site, while elsewhere inscriptions to local forms of Mars suggest temples dedicated to deities, whose character remained Celtic, even when their names were partially adapted to Roman religious vocabulary. Ritual headgear and crowns found in other regions may have belonged to priests or cult statues. In Hertfordshire, a remarkable group of bronze and silver objects includes figures of Mars, leaf-shaped silver plaques, and dedications to local war gods identified with Roman deities. These objects were clearly part of a shrine's equipment and reveal how Roman and Celtic religious language could overlap without erasing the native character of the cult. The divine figures may wear Roman names, but their setting, attributes, and ritual use often remain rooted in older traditions. Near Colchester, a sanctuary dedicated to a woodland god identified with Silvanus shows this blending especially well. The local deity remained meaningful enough to be preserved, even as Roman terminology tried to fit him into a Mediterranean framework. Other temple complexes in southern Britain show the same pattern. They may appear Romanized in their layout, but their plans often follow native preferences, especially the repeated use of square sanctuaries within enclosed sacred space. At Wroxeter, images of multi-faced heads and other distinctly local carvings reveal that the cult life of these temples cannot be understood as purely Roman. Nearby sites at Sheepen and Gosbecks tell a similar story, showing that sacred landscapes around major settlements could include multiple shrines serving different but related devotional needs. Most of the better-known where excavation has been more extensive and preservation more favourable. Yet the north also provides important evidence. There were sanctuaries dedicated to local gods, whose names survive only in scattered inscriptions, and others can be inferred from the distribution of offerings and carved plaques. Some northern shrines seem to have centred on strongly regional deities, perhaps patrons of valleys, forests, hunting grounds or tribal territories. One sanctuary in Yorkshire, dedicated to a god associated with wild country and possibly the vine or woodland growth, seems to have belonged to a landscape cult in which the divine was tied to remote terrain rather than urban settlement. These northern examples show that the sacred geography of Roman Britain remained intensely local. Many more shrines almost certainly once existed. Some were destroyed before their significance could be recognised. Others may still lie hidden, their traces dismissed as ordinary building remains. This uncertainty becomes especially important when turning to the priests most often associated with Celtic religion, the Druids. Few figures from ancient Europe have gathered more legend around them than the Druids. Over the centuries, they became the centre of romantic speculation, especially in later antiquarian writing. They were imagined as sages of megalithic Britain, philosophers of the oak woods, guardians of lost wisdom, and priests of monuments far older than the Celtic world itself. Yet most of this image belongs to much later imagination rather than to reliable ancient evidence. When that later mythology is stripped away, surprisingly little certain information remains. The real Druids are far harder to grasp than the ones invented by poets and enthusiasts. Most of what is actually known comes from Greek and Roman writers, and even those accounts are not free from misunderstanding. These writers often looked at foreign priesthoods through the lens of their own philosophical traditions. Because of that, the Druids were sometimes described less as they truly were and more as Mediterranean observers wish them to be. Even so, a broad outline emerges. By the time the ancient world began recording them clearly, the Druids were already an old institution among at least some Celtic peoples. They were not marginal ritual specialists. They belonged to the upper levels of society and appear to have been recruited from the warrior aristocracy. In a strongly hierarchical culture, this makes perfect sense. Religion, law, and power were closely tied together. The Druids acted as priests, judges, ritual experts, and interpreters of divine will. They regulated sacrifice and possessed the authority to exclude individuals from it, which amounted to a severe form of social and religious punishment. Their influence, therefore, extended far beyond ceremony. They had legal power, moral authority, and a central role in preserving social order. Ancient descriptions suggest that they gathered at major assemblies and recognized some form of internal hierarchy, perhaps even a chief among them. Their training was long and demanding, based not on books but on memorization. Students may have spent many years learning sacred material orally, preserving formulas, teachings, and ritual knowledge entirely through disciplined transmission. In this, they resemble other traditional priestly or learned classes, whose power rested on exclusive command of memory. Ancient writers sometimes describe the Druids as philosophers, but that label is probably misleading. It reflects an attempt to translate a foreign priesthood into terms familiar to educated Greek and Roman readers. There is no solid reason to imagine the Druids as philosophers in the classical sense. They were intellectual authorities within their own culture, certainly, but their knowledge seems to have been practical, sacred, legal, and ritual rather than abstract in the Greek manner. They may have taught about the cosmos, the stars, and the reckoning of time, and they certainly dealt with fate, death, sacrifice, and the divine order of society. But the image of the Druid as a kind of Celtic Pythagoras, belongs more to classical interpretation than to secure historical reality. One belief strongly associated with them is the idea that life continues after death. Ancient authors emphasize that they taught some form of survival beyond the grave, and this belief may have encouraged bravery in battle by weakening the fear of death. Archaeology gives this claim some support. Celtic graves often contain weapons, ornaments, tools, and objects for feasting, suggesting that the dead were imagined as continuing in another state where such things still mattered. This does not necessarily amount to a fully developed doctrine of transmigration in the philosophical sense. Later, readers often pushed the evidence too far, treating every story of transformation or shape changing in Celtic myth as proof of reincarnation. But Celtic legend is full of beings who change form simply because transformation is part of the supernatural world they inhabit. Gods, heroes, animals, and spirits slip across boundaries continually. That is not the same thing as a formal theory of souls passing from body to body. What can be said with more confidence is that the Druids belong to a culture deeply preoccupied with the other world and with the persistence of life after visible death. Human sacrifice is another subject that cannot be ignored. Ancient testimony on this point is too consistent to dismiss entirely, even if some accounts are clearly coloured by hostility or sensationalism. Roman authors describe spectacular rites involving large structures filled with victims and set on fire. And whether every detail is true or not, there is little reason to doubt that sacrifice could take grim and violent forms. Such practices fit with a wider ritual world already visible through pits, deposits, severed heads, and sanctuaries linked to war and death. The Druids, if these sources are to be trusted, stood at the centre of that sacrificial system. Some ancient writers also state that the Druids taught the descent of the Celtic peoples from a common divine ancestor. Whether this was a formal doctrine or an outsider's simplified interpretation, matches a broader pattern visible in Celtic tradition, where tribes, landscapes, and peoples are repeatedly linked to named, ancestral or divine figures. In such a world, genealogy was never merely human. It connected communities to sacred origins. Perhaps the most famous ancient image of the Druids is the cutting of mistletoe from an oak with a golden sickle, performed by a white-robed priest before the sacrifice of white bulls. This scene became one of the great symbols of later Druid romanticism. Yet even if the dramatic details were shaped by literary taste, the underlying themes are consistent with the wider sacred world of the Celts. The holiness of the oak, the ritual significance of special plants, the role of sacrifice, and the public authority of the priesthood. In Britain itself, however, direct evidence for Druids is frustratingly thin. Later tradition speaks of them often enough, but by then they have become magicians, prophets, wise men, advisors, or shapeshifters, rather than the full political and religious force implied by classical testimony. Their older public authority has faded. There is also no valid evidence linking them with Stonehenge, or with the megalithic monuments so often assigned to them by later imagination. That entire picture belongs to much later fantasy. The clearest ancient account of Druids in Britain comes from the Roman attack on Anglesey. There, Roman forces encountered a sacred stronghold in which priests stood among groves while dark-clothed women moved among them in a terrifying ritual display. The place was destroyed, and with it perhaps one of the last major organised centres of insular Druidic power. Finds from Anglesey, including large deposits of weapons and ritual objects, may preserve the material shadow of that violent end. Yet beyond such moments, the Druids remain elusive. No inscription securely identifies them in Britain, and no unmistakable image preserves their likeness. In Ireland, Memories of the Druids survive far more clearly than in most other Celtic lands. The chief druid attached to the High King is described in a way that feels strikingly archaic, dressed in ritual garments that seem designed not merely for ceremony, but for transformation. In one account, he appears wrapped in a bull hide and wearing a white speckled bird headdress with wings fluttering above him, a costume that gives him the appearance of someone standing between the human world and the animal or spirit realm. In another setting, he is shown in rich clothing and gold earrings, which reveals something equally important. The Druid was not simply a wild, holy man of the woods, but a figure of prestige, rank, and display. In Scotland too, traces of the order may have lingered into the early Christian centuries, if later tradition preserves any truth in stories of holy men confronting Druids, who still held influence in local society. By that stage, their world was already fading, but the memory of their presence had not yet disappeared. The old seasonal festivals almost certainly belonged to their sphere of authority. Two moments in the pastoral year stand out above all others: Beltane at the beginning of May and Samhain at the start of November. These were not minor observances, they marked turning points in the movement of animals, in the rhythm of settlement, and in the dangerous transitions between seasons. Beltane especially seems to have involved rites of protection, including the driving of cattle between ritual fires, an act that was probably meant to purify, guard, and strengthen the herds before they moved into summer pasture. Samhain, standing at the dark threshold of winter, likely carried a more ominous tone, linked with death, spirits, and the opening of the boundary between worlds. In a fully pagan setting, both festivals would almost certainly have included sacrifice. Fire, blood, livestock, blessing, danger, and divine favour would all have been bound together in ceremonies overseen by ritual specialists who understood the old formulas and the proper timing of sacred acts. When the surviving evidence is stripped of later fantasy, the religion associated with the Druids appears far less mysterious than popular imagination likes to believe. It does not reveal a highly developed philosophical system or a refined theology hidden in forest sanctuaries. Instead, it suggests a priesthood rooted in an older and more familiar type of sacred culture, one centered on ritual performance, sacrifice, divination, and the management of dangerous, supernatural forces. The surviving evidence simply does not support the romantic image of the Druids as deep philosophers guarding a secret wisdom beyond that of the ancient world. Their beliefs were serious and powerful within their own society, but they seem to have belonged to the practical world of ritual power rather than abstract speculation. Even so, some important questions remain open. It is still possible that the Druidic order had roots older than the spread of Celtic languages, and it is not certain whether this priesthood belonged to the whole Celtic-speaking world or was mostly confined to Gaul and the British Isles. It is also clear that Greek and Roman authors interpreted the Druids through their own intellectual habits. That matters, because ancient observers often tried to explain foreign religions by comparing them to philosophical schools or priesthoods they already knew. In doing so, they may have exaggerated some features and misunderstood others. The result is that the Druids entered written history already half transformed by outside interpretation. Much of their later fame was built on that fragile foundation. A clear picture of Celtic sanctuaries is equally difficult to recover. Very little survives in direct form, and what can be said must be drawn from fragments, patterns, and comparison. In the period before Roman rule, their shrines were probably extremely simple. Many may have been built of timber, wickerwork, earth, or wattle and daub, materials that vanish easily once abandoned. Others may have been made with plain stone walls requiring little foundation, leaving only the faintest trace in the ground. Because of this, the sacred places of the Celts are often easier to identify by what they surrounded than by the buildings themselves. The centre of worship was often not the structure, but the sacred feature to which it was attached. A spring, a well, a river source, a great tree, a burial mound, or some other place marked by memory and legend could become the focus of ritual life. Around such places, simple shrines may have been raised, or rites may have been performed in the open air. Sacred stories would then gather around the place, tying it to a local deity, a supernatural event, or a divine ancestor. At the source of a river, the water itself could be treated as the visible body of an unseen power. Worship might begin at the spring and extend along the flow of the river. In Gaul, the evidence for shrines connected with river sources is especially persuasive. In Britain, the structures are less clear, yet the wider pattern strongly suggests that the source of a powerful river could be revered in much the same way. The logic is easy to understand. A spring rising mysteriously from the earth, feeding a great river, would appear as a direct manifestation of life, fertility, and hidden force. To a sacred imagination, such a place would not merely symbolize power, it would contain it. The same holds true for wells, which seem to have been imagined not only as holy places but as openings into another realm. Like the grave mound, the well appears to have stood at the edge of the other world. Alongside wells and springs, there is also a remarkable group of shafts and pits, whose ritual character is difficult to deny. Though they differ in form, many seem to belong to a shared tradition, in which the earth itself became a setting for offerings, deposits, and possibly sacrifice, and some of these places were probably feared as much as revered. They were not neutral holes in the ground. They were controlled openings into a space beneath ordinary life. In the Roman period, some sacred springs became enclosed within more formal buildings of stone, and these often formed the centre of temple worship. Yet even then, the old logic remained unchanged. The water, not the masonry, was the true source of sanctity. Roman builders may have transformed the outward appearance of the sanctuary, but they did not create the sacred power of the place. The same pattern applies to trees and groves. Certain trees, especially those standing alone on plains, or growing near wells and burial mounds, seem to have been treated as holy landmarks. Groves too held deep importance, and the word used for sacred grove appears widely across Celtic place names. Yet a sacred grove was not always just an untamed patch of woodland. In some cases, it may have included an enclosure, an earthwork, or a built shrine. A grove could be both natural and organised, both living, landscape, and sacred precinct. The literary traditions of the Celtic world preserve this reverence clearly. Heroes are repeatedly compared to noble trees. Deities and supernatural beings are linked with oaks, yews, ash trees, hazels, and fruit-bearing branches. A great tree could stand at the centre of assembly, memory, prophecy, and royal legitimacy. In such a world, a tree was never merely decorative. It was an axis of meaning, a sign of continuity, endurance, and power. Sacred trees and sacred waters often seem to have belonged together, joined in the same religious landscape. Burial mounds also appear to have functioned as sanctuaries of a kind. Celtic belief placed strong emphasis on a continued existence beyond death, and the tomb could be imagined not only as a resting place, but as an inhabited dwelling of the dead. Great prehistoric mounds were reinterpreted as houses of divine or semi-divine beings. The later tradition of fairy mounds likely preserves something of this older vision. Where there were ancestral tombs, there may also have been offerings, rites, gatherings, and perhaps simple shrines raised nearby. It was natural for a culture so intensely aware of the dead and of the other world to treat ancient burial places as entrances into a realm still active and dangerous. Across Central Europe, enclosed ritual sites reinforce this broader image. Some ditched sanctuaries, often complex and difficult to interpret, point to a network of sacred spaces that may once have been far more widespread than surviving evidence suggests. Comparable sites may have existed in Britain without being recognised for what they were. A few excavated examples reveal combinations of pits, posts, deposits, and enclosure ditches that suggest controlled ritual environments, rather than ordinary settlement. These places may have hosted sacrifice, feasting, offerings, and ceremonies tied to death, kingship, or tribal identity. Later, legendary halls and dangerous hostels in Irish tradition may even preserve distant memories of such places, transformed into story after the original rituals were forgotten. Large stone-built temples of an unmistakably monumental type were rare in the Celtic world before outside influence. A few exceptional sanctuaries in the south, shaped by Mediterranean architectural traditions, cannot be taken as typical. More substantial temple building only spread widely under Roman rule. Then, the familiar double-square Romano-Celtic temple begins to appear across Celtic regions, creating a distinct hybrid form. These temples often housed both local and Roman divine identities at the same time, and in many cases they probably rose over older shrines or sacred enclosures already long established in native religion. At places such as Lydney and Maiden Castle, the complexity of the later temple does not erase the likelihood of earlier sanctity. Roman period interest in ancient sacred ground can also be seen in the placing of coins and altars at prehistoric barrows and in the renewed use of long revered sites. Excavated foundations from places like Heathrow and Frilford prove that actual temple structures already existed in Britain before the Roman conquest. These may have been modest timber sanctuaries rather than monumental buildings, but they were real shrines all the same. Beyond them, there must also have been countless smaller roadside sanctuaries, and gathering places attached to tribes, local cults, and seasonal assemblies. Any attempt to understand Celtic sacred space must therefore include the people responsible for controlling it. Priests were necessary to conduct rites, preserve formulas, and regulate sacrifice. That is why the Druids remain important, even if the evidence for them is far less dramatic than legend suggests. Two major sources of confusion must always be set aside. The first is the romantic invention of later centuries, which transformed them into mystical sages of a fantasy past. The second is the temptation to treat prehistoric ritual sites as automatic proof of Druidic activity. Some of those places may indeed have been used by priests, later remembered as Druids, but without direct inscription or written testimony that cannot be demonstrated. What remains are the scattered comments of classical writers, and even these become less solid the more closely they are examined. From all of this, one conclusion stands out. The Celtic priests were not the profound philosophers imagined by later admirers or by some ancient observers eager to find noble wisdom among distant peoples. They seem instead to have belonged to a ritual world that was older, rougher, and more immediate. Their concerns were sacrifice, prophecy, purification, taboo, and the handling of divine danger. They were not detached thinkers exploring abstract truth. They were specialists in sacred power. In many ways, they resemble the ritual experts and ecstatic, holy figures found across traditional societies. Priests, magicians, judges, memory keepers, and interpreters of the unseen. Their world was one in which shape-shifting, omens, sacred animals, and dangerous gods all formed part of a living religious system. That does not make them less important. It makes them more historically believable. At this point, the wider setting of Celtic religion has begun to take shape. The outline is still incomplete, and many details remain out of reach, but enough survives to imagine how these beliefs functioned in real places, among real communities and through repeated ritual action. When speaking of Celtic religion, it is useful to divide it into themes or cult patterns, yet those divisions should never be treated as rigid compartments. Celtic belief did not work like a neatly organized system of separate and isolated doctrines. Its symbols moved across different spheres of worship, merging and reappearing in new forms. A single image could belong to more than one sacred meaning at the same time. The cult of the head is one of the clearest examples. It is not only a theme on its own, but something that runs through nearly every other part of Celtic religious life. The horned god overlaps with warrior symbolism. The severed head appears in art, warfare, shrine decoration, myth, and ritual practice. These themes are best studied one by one, but in reality they constantly flowed into each other. That fluidity tells a great deal about the religious imagination of the Celtic world. Even with all the similarities shared across Celtic regions, local differences must have mattered. The religion practiced in Britain and Ireland cannot have been identical to that of Gaul or the more Romanized parts of the continent. The broad pattern is recognizable everywhere, yet each region must have emphasized certain divine types, local sacred places, and inherited customs in its own way. Even so, one symbol appears with such force, such range, and such persistence that it stands out above the rest: the human head. No other image seems to have carried such deep, lasting, and unmistakable sacred weight. Across Celtic Europe, and especially in the insular world, the head was treated not simply as a body part, but as a vessel of power, a visible sign of spiritual force, and in many contexts a symbol of divinity itself. The importance of the human head stretches across the entire record of Celtic religion. It appears in sculpture, on metalwork, on coins, in shrine decoration, in battlefield customs, and in later storytelling. The severed head in particular remained central for an astonishing length of time, from the earliest available evidence to the much later literary traditions of Ireland and Wales. Because this symbol returns again and again, it becomes necessary to pause and examine it in its own right before moving deeper into the rest of Celtic religion. The cult of the head was not a minor feature or an eccentric habit. It was one of the most characteristic and revealing expressions of the Celtic sacred mind. Yet the Celts were not alone in giving special importance to the head. Reverence for the human skull, or the belief that the head carried unusual power, is found among many peoples and in many early cultures. From very ancient periods onward, the human head seems to have attracted fear, wonder, and ritual attention. Archaeological discoveries from prehistoric Europe and the Near East show skulls carefully grouped, decorated, or separated from the body in ways that suggest more than simple burial. Some were covered with pigment, others were ornamented or reshaped. In various societies, the head could become a war trophy, an ancestral relic, or an object believed to retain some part of the person's force after death. Even the practice of tree panning, cutting into the skull, sometimes seems to have carried more than medical significance. The head was widely understood as a special and dangerous part of the human body long before the Celtic world came into view. What makes the Celts remarkable is not that they respected the head, but the intensity and consistency with which they developed that respect. They carried it further, gave it more artistic and symbolic range, and embedded it more deeply into their religion than most neighbouring peoples. Throughout the Celtic world, the head became both image and object, symbol and trophy, decoration and focus of devotion. This fascination seems to have deep roots. Its ancestry likely reaches back into Bronze Age Europe, and perhaps even earlier, where the head already had symbolic force, perhaps even connected in some cases with solar imagery. Later, outside influence also played a role. Contact with Etruria seems to have helped shape certain visual forms, especially the use of the sculpted head as a shorthand for the whole warrior or for concentrated life force. Among the Celts, however, these outside elements were not merely borrowed, they were transformed. The head became part of a distinctly Celtic language of sacred power. A striking example of this appears in carved stone pillars from the continental Celtic world, where human heads and stylized organic forms are combined in ways that suggest both fertility and apotropaic force. In such monuments, imported influences and native religious ideas are blended into something unmistakably local. The pillar itself may carry one set of associations, the head another, yet together they create a symbol of power, more forceful than either element alone. This kind of visual invention is typical of Celtic art. It does not simply copy. It absorbs and reshapes. In Gaul, the evidence for the cult of the head is overwhelming. Before and during Roman rule, the theme appears repeatedly in sculpture, coinage, and sanctuary remains. Some temple sites have yielded large groups of stone heads, many of them carved in a style so primitive and direct that they seem to preserve traditions far older than the Roman period. Animal figures and other votive objects found beside them only reinforce the sense that these were not decorative ornaments, but part of an active, sacred environment. The head, in these contexts, was treated as a focal image of supernatural force. The written evidence from classical authors adds another crucial layer. Ancient writers describe Celtic warriors cutting off the heads of defeated enemies, displaying them on horses, on spears, or around the entrances of houses and strongholds. The heads of especially important opponents were preserved, exhibited, and treasured as lasting signs of victory and prestige. Some accounts even say they were embalmed and stored carefully, with their owners refusing to sell them for enormous sums. Such reports could easily sound exaggerated if there were no material evidence to support them. But archaeology confirms that these descriptions were not fantasy. They reflect a real and deeply rooted custom. The sanctuaries of southern Gaul provide some of the strongest confirmation. At temple sites there, real skulls and sculpted heads have been found built into the structure or displayed in clearly ritual settings. Human crania were set into niches, sometimes alongside images of horses or birds, in buildings that seem to have been dedicated to martial gods. The dead were not hidden away. Their heads were made visible, monumental, and sacred. In some places, skulls were discovered near altars, suggesting that the offering or display of enemy heads was not only a military custom, but a ritual act directed toward the gods. The head in Celtic religion was therefore more than a token of victory. It was a charged object capable of carrying power from the battlefield into the sacred world. This same pattern appears in Britain and Ireland. Although the classical texts speak mostly of the continental Celts, insular archaeology and early literature make it clear that head-taking and head veneration were fully at home in the British Isles as well. In heroic tales from Ireland, warriors return from battle with the heads of enemies, display them in triumph, and treat them as proof of prowess. Archaeological finds from Britain support this picture. Human skulls discovered near entrances, gateways, or defensive structures suggest deliberate display, recalling the ancient descriptions of heads mounted on poles or fixed around walls. The consistency between literature, archaeology, and classical observation is too strong to ignore. The roots of this belief in Britain may go back even earlier than the arrival of Celtic speech. There are prehistoric objects from Britain that seem already to treat the head as a protective or sacred image. Some small carved forms from burial contexts show stylized faces reduced to simple lines and circles. Their inclusion in graves suggests an apotropaic function, as though the image of the face itself could guard or empower the dead. Later examples continue this pattern in more recognizably Celtic form. Pebbles shaped roughly like human heads were sometimes modified with incised facial features, creating simple but powerful objects that feel less like portraits than symbolic presences. Metalwork from Iron Age Britain makes the importance of the head even clearer. The face appears again and again on shields, horse gear, chariots, dagger hilts, and ceremonial fittings. Sometimes the features are realistic enough to suggest a person. More often they are stylized into masks, reduced to essential elements like eyes, moustache, brows, and hair, creating a face that is more sign than likeness. These images were not placed randomly. On shields and harness, they may have served as protective signs. On weapon hilts, they may have bound the object to supernatural power. In Celtic thought, the world of objects was not sharply separated from the world of spirits. A weapon could be alive with force. A decorated face on metal could do more than represent. It could guard, empower, or invoke. Coinage also shows how central the head remained. Across both Gaul and Britain, coins feature not ordinary portraiture in the Mediterranean sense, but transformed and often divine heads. These faces are heavily stylized, abstracted, and sometimes combined with horns, animal features, or doubled forms. Some look male and bearded, others clean-shaven, others impossible to classify by ordinary human standards. A janiform head with two faces looking in opposite directions points to a divine figure conceived as double or all-seeing. Horned heads may connect the coin image to gods of war, fertility, or sovereign power. In these cases, the head on the coin is not a royal portrait in the later sense. It is a sacred sign, part of a visual theology compressed into metal. Some of the most impressive examples come from Britain in the period just before the Roman conquest. Faces appear on bowls, vats, and buckets used in ritual or elite burial. Their eyes may once have been inset with enamel or coral. Some are frontal and staring, others shown in profile, some wearing helmets, others bearing horns. These vessel heads suggest that sacred drinking and feasting had their own visual language, and that the human face itself was central to that language. Such containers may have held alcohol for ritual occasions, communal feasts, or funerary ceremonies. Their decoration was therefore not incidental. The face on the vessel watched over the act of offering and consumption. The same symbolic habit appears in larger stone carvings from Britain and nearby regions. Some are so crude that they could belong either to the late Iron Age or to the early Roman period. That uncertainty actually says something important. The tradition remained conservative. Even after Roman influence arrived, older ways of shaping the sacred face continued. Pillars with carved heads, pebbles altered into mask-like forms, triple-faced heads, and human features cut into phallic or upright stones all point to a living visual tradition that valued the human face as a sacred sign, regardless of changing artistic fashions. These were not refined portraits, they were embodiments of force. What emerges from all of this is not simply a warrior custom, though warfare clearly played a major part. The severed head could indeed function as a trophy, an emblem of courage and victory. But in Celtic religion it meant more than military triumph. It seems to have been treated as the seat of life, identity, power, and even contact with the other world. A severed head could continue to matter because the force once contained in the living person had not entirely departed. The head was the most expressive and spiritually charged part of the body. It could protect, terrify, sanctify, and symbolize the divine all at once. Most of the heads that seem likely to belong to the period before the Roman conquest have already been considered. yet the largest body of material comes from Roman Britain, where native belief continued under the surface while local artists absorbed techniques and habits from provincial Roman art. In that world, the sacred head did not disappear. On the contrary, it became one of the most common and revealing cult images in Britain. Stone heads, relief heads, horned heads, double heads, triple heads, and masks with clear religious force appear again and again. Their distribution is especially striking in the north, above all around Hadrian's Wall. That concentration is not surprising. This was a militarized frontier, restless, exposed, and violent. In such a landscape, the old respect for the severed head and the protective power of the sacred face would have remained intensely meaningful. The North produced a remarkable series of cult heads, and together they show just how many forms this symbol could take. One of the most important patterns is the appearance of multiple heads. For the Celts, the number 3 carried unusual force. It had a sacred quality that appears repeatedly in story, ritual structure, and divine representation. Triads appear in myth. Triple groupings appear in memory formulas and sacred tradition. It is therefore entirely fitting that some deities should be shown as 3-faced beings. In parts of Gaul, the triple-headed god seems to have acted as a native equivalent for a major divine power, and similar ideas reach Britain and Ireland as well. True triple heads are rare in Britain, but the examples that do survive are memorable. One especially striking example is a rounded 3-faced head, once said to have come from the far north of Scotland. Whether or not that original provenance is correct, the object itself is unmistakably important. Each face is typically Celtic in style, with large eyes, a narrow nose, a straight mouth, and a heavy moustache. The 3 faces are spaced evenly around the stone, and the top contains a deep hollow, suggesting that the object served as a small shrine or ritual vessel. This is a crucial detail. The head was not merely an image. It was likely used in actual ritual, perhaps for libation or some other offering. Its features belong to the same visual world as the masks of late Iron Age metalwork, even if the object itself may have moved from one place to another over time. Ireland preserves a related tradition in an especially vivid way. A 3-faced stone head from Cavan extends this imagery into the Irish world, and its style is deeply revealing. The faces are not bearded, but they belong fully to the same visual language as many Iron Age Celtic heads. The eyes are wide, the nose long and straight, and the expression is static and mask-like rather than lifelike. A hole in the base suggests that the head once stood on a pillar or support, probably displayed upright as an object of reverence. Another triple head later found in Donegal strengthens the impression that this was not an isolated curiosity. It points instead to a broader native tradition in which the divine could be shown as multiple, yet unified, concentrated in a single carved object. Guernsey adds another important piece to the picture. There, a 3-headed image survives in which the heads are attached to a bust, rather than merely carved around a rounded block. The style places it near the early Roman period, yet the concept is unmistakably older. At Wroxeter in Western Britain, another multi-faced stone head appears, probably once belonging to a larger architectural feature. It is crude in execution by classical standards, but entirely coherent within the native tradition. A second head from the same area repeats some of the same features, reinforcing the sense that local divine images were still being produced in a recognisably Celtic manner, even in Romanised settings. This habit of showing divinity in multiplied form did not end with the Roman period. In later contexts from Wales and Ireland, there are objects that still preserve the old habit of joined or repeated faces, even if their exact dating is uncertain. What matters most is that the visual idea endured. Triple profiles on coins, three-headed figures in metalwork, and fused heads in wood or ivory all point to the same basic religious instinct. The divine could be one and many at once. Multiplicity itself could be sacred. Alongside triple heads, there are also double, or Janus-like heads. These may reflect an old Celtic fascination with twinning and doubleness, perhaps linked to the perceived power of twins and paired divine beings. Roman influence may have reinforced this imagery through familiarity with Janus, but the basic idea already had native roots. Coins from both Gaul and Britain show two-faced heads, and some carved objects from Britain and Ireland continue the pattern. One object found in London, carved from deer antler, shows a face on each side and was likely used as an amulet or protective object. Another from Corbridge on the northern frontier presents a larger and a smaller face on opposite sides. The larger face has the long nose, heavy brows, and austere expression so common in native cult heads, while the second face is cruder and subordinate, as though the stone carried a doubling of force rather than a balanced pair of equals. Ireland again preserves especially powerful examples. One carved figure from Fermanagh shows two large heads joined back to back above simplified bodies. A hollow between the heads suggests that the object may have received offerings. The effect is not decorative. It feels cultic, concentrated, and strangely alive. Another Irish example from Clare places two faces side by side in a highly unusual arrangement. Yet the style of the features still belongs to the same old visual tradition. Whether these were carved in the late Pagan period or later, by communities still preserving older forms, they testify to the deep persistence of the sacred head as a religious image. Another major group is formed by horned heads. These belong to the wider cult of horned gods and are especially important in the north. The horned head is fully at home in a pastoral and warlike landscape. It combines strength, animal power, divine authority, and the energy of untamed nature. In regions exposed to constant pressure, especially along the northern frontier, such imagery is exactly what would be expected. Some of the finest horned heads in Britain come from the vicinity of Hadrian's Wall. A particularly impressive example from the far northwest shows a powerful male face with a narrow nose, flattened cheeks, and intense, narrowed eyes. The most striking feature is the pair of ram horns that curve down toward the ears. The face is stern and almost militarized in expression, as though the god itself is being shown as vigilant and formidable. Another head from Carvoran is cruder but equally revealing. The facial hair is marked, the eyes are huge, the ears oddly exaggerated, and the broken stumps of horns still survive. It may once have been set into a wall or structure, functioning as a protective and sacred image at the same time. Several more horned heads come from the same frontier region. Some are worked in relief, others nearly in the round, but together they show that the horned god was one of the most deeply rooted, divine images in the north. One figure from County Durham is especially telling because the head dominates a tiny body beneath it. The message is clear. The body matters less than the face and the horns. Another relief from southern Scotland presents a horned head with a slightly protruding tongue, a detail that recalls later Irish images and points again to the continuity of native visual habits across the Irish Sea and the northern British world. Farther south, horned heads continue to appear, though sometimes in altered form. In one case from the West Country, the projection from the head seems to take the form of antlers, rather than ram horns, which links the image to the broader cult of antlered divinity known elsewhere in Celtic religion. Even where Roman style begins to influence the composition, the idea remains native. The horned divine head is not a borrowed classical figure. It is an indigenous image wearing the outer clothing of Roman art. Some heads were designed not just as images, but as ritual containers. This detail is easy to miss, but it matters enormously. A cavity cut into the top or between joined faces suggests a practical use in cult, whether for liquid offering, incense, or some form of sacred deposit. In such cases, the head becomes shrine and image at once. It does not merely represent the sacred, it receives it. That idea may preserve a very old tradition, one in which actual human skulls had once been used in cult and later stone versions took over some of the same symbolic functions. Other heads are marked not by horns but by the torque, the heavy neck ornament so closely associated with rank, magic, and divine presence in the Celtic world. When a head wears a torque, the meaning is hard to miss. This is not an ordinary mortal face, it belongs to a being of higher force. The torque appears on several important heads from the wider Celtic world, and in Britain too it remains an occasional but meaningful feature. Its presence beneath the chin or around the neck turns a head into a clear statement of supernatural identity. Then there are the many heads with no obvious attribute at all. These may be the most revealing of all, because they suggest that the sacred head did not always need a horn, a torque, or a special symbol to carry force. The face itself was enough. Around Hadrian's Wall and beyond, many stone heads survive that are blunt, direct, and deeply native in style. Some are detached from statues, others are blocks with only the simplest features indicated. Yet their power lies precisely in that simplicity. Eyes and nose may be the only details emphasized, as though those alone are enough to make presence visible. One head from the northwest is almost reduced to the barest human schema, and yet it remains unmistakably a cult image. Another from the same broad region is cut into a square block without any attempt to naturalize the outline. The face is framed within the stone like a force held in place rather than released into sculptural realism. This squared style appears elsewhere as well. A head found in Yorkshire shows the same rigid framing, the same severe features, and the same refusal of softness or illusion. These are not failed attempts at realism. They belong to another intention entirely. The object is not trying to imitate a human being as seen in life. It is condensing the human face into a sacred sign. Other heads from northern Britain show more modelling, but still remain firmly within the native tradition. One found near Appleby presents narrowed eyes, a straight mouth, and a strangely martial expression. Another from Chester's is more worn, but still preserves the familiar wedge-shaped nose and large eyes. Corbridge has yielded additional examples, including one with a low brow, severe mouth, and a linear treatment of beard and moustache. These heads are often expressionless in the ordinary sense, yet their stillness is intense. They do not smile, plead, or narrate. They confront. Some heads may represent goddesses rather than gods. A remarkable example from southern Scotland wears what looks like a close-fitting cap or ceremonial head covering. The eyes are unusually flattened, the mouth slightly downturned, and the whole expression is reserved and solemn. The object feels less like a portrait than a presence. A different head from York is equally striking, with heavy hair rising into two pointed peaks and a face both stern and inward. It may represent a local underworld or chthonic power rather than a war god, showing that the cult of the head ranged far beyond battle symbolism alone. From central and western Britain, more heads appear that are harder to date closely, but still belong clearly to this same world. One from Somerset, found near a Roman building, has lidless eyes and a strangely archaic face, almost as though a prehistoric carving tradition had survived into the Roman age. Another from South Wales was found inside a shrine and was clearly meant to be viewed frontally. Its eyes stand out strongly, the nose is long, and the ears are unusually treated, perhaps even prepared to receive inserted attachments. A second Welsh head from the northwest is simpler and more linear, but carries the same severe intensity. Objects like these show that the sacred head was not confined to one region or one workshop style. It appeared wherever native cult continued to shape local imagination. Some stones show single heads, while others show pairs. A relief from Lincolnshire presents one male head with long moustache and flowing hair, very likely intended as a votive image. Another from the same area places two heads close together in a way that strongly suggests a deliberate paired representation, rather than accidental crowding. These paired or multiple images remind us once again that Celtic divinity did not always conform to the singular, isolated body of classical art. Powers could be doubled, fused, or repeated. A special group of heads deserves separate attention because of their resemblance to the classical Gorgon or Medusa. In the Roman world, the Gorgon head was a familiar apotropaic image, placed on shields, buildings, and sacred structures to repel danger. Yet in Celtic Britain, this type seems to have been absorbed into local religious language and transformed. The result is not a true classical Medusa, but something more complex. A fusion of native sacred head imagery with Roman decorative convention. The best-known example is the great head from the temple pediment at Bath. Although often described through the language of classical art, the face itself is unmistakably male and deeply native in expression. The beard, moustache, heavy features and intense gaze do not belong to the ordinary Greco-Roman Medusa type. Serpents wind through the hair and beard, drawing on a classical motif. Yet the whole image feels closer to the Celtic divine head than to a Mediterranean monster. The result is a brilliant hybrid, entirely at home in a sanctuary centered on healing waters and a local goddess translated into Roman terms. Similar heads appear elsewhere. One from Chester, used in a funerary setting, again fuses the Gorgon pattern with a male Celtic face. Another from Caerleon pushes the blending even further. The brow is furrowed, the eyes large, the mouth firm, and serpents twist through the beard while horn-like growths emerge from the head. This is no simple copy of Roman art. It is a local sacred image speaking through an imported visual frame. A monument from Maryport adds yet another layer. One side shows a serpent. The other bears a severed head framed by what may be serpents rising around it. The combination is extraordinary. Here, the sacred head, the serpent, and perhaps even phallic symbolism meet in a single image. It suggests that the same religious logic visible at Bath could take other, rougher, more explicitly native forms in the north. A fragment from Wallsend may belong to this family as well, with a circular face that combines stern native features with something of the Gorgon's protective function. One final head from Somerset, simple and circular, with large eyes and a severe mouth, belongs to this larger network of local cult images. On its own, it might seem isolated. In context, it is not. It stands among a broad company of faces carved for shrines, forts, tombs, sacred enclosures, and perhaps household or wayside sanctuaries. Taken together, these heads show that Roman Britain did not abandon the old sacred language of the face. Instead, it multiplied it. Another important variation of the sacred head appears in what can be called the phallic head. There is strong reason to think that, in some Celtic contexts, the severed human head placed on top of a pillar also carried a sexual and generative meaning. Two powerful symbols were being fused into one image. The head represented concentrated life, force, and identity. The The pillar beneath it, shaped in a way that suggested the male organ, introduced another layer of meaning tied to fertility, potency, and protective strength. When these two elements were joined, the result was not crude decoration. It was a charged religious form combining vitality, protection, and reproductive power in a single monument. This may explain why explicit phallic imagery appears less often in Celtic art than might otherwise be expected. The symbol was present, but it had been transformed into something more indirect and more characteristic of Celtic visual thinking. Several stones from Britain belong to this group. In each case, the pillar and the head are carved as one object, with the face set onto the rounded top so that the whole monument works as a symbolic body. These stones do not present the phallus naturalistically. Instead, they turn it into a sacred sign, just as the Celts so often preferred to suggest rather than spell out. Some of these monuments also carry additional decoration, which only strengthens the impression that they had more than one function at once. They could protect, bless, and perhaps express fertility, in a ritual sense. The sacred head, already understood as the seat of life force, became even more powerful when placed on such an upright stone. It was no longer only a trophy or a divine image, it was also an emblem of generative energy and survival. The same religious logic continues in metalwork. The human head had already played a major role in pre-Roman-Celtic metal art, so it is no surprise that this tradition survived into Roman Britain. Some early examples still belong fully to the old Iron Age world in style and feeling. Bronze heads from elite burial equipment show combed hair, huge outlined eyes, moustaches, and close-trimmed beards that speak directly to the older La Teni tradition. One horned bronze fitting used on horse or chariot equipment turns the head into an unmistakable apotropaic sign. Its eyes are huge, its brows heavy, and its expression severe. The head is not passive decoration. It looks made to ward off harm and assert force. Other fittings from Roman Britain continue this pattern. Some human faces appear on basin handles or strap mounts. Some bear horn stumps or knobbed projections in the old native fashion. Others combine several sacred images at once. A striking example joins a human face to a bull head and a bird of prey in a single complex bronze mount. Another shows the same taste for symbolic compression, where bird, beast, and face are fused into one ritual object. These are not casual designs. They belong to a religious vocabulary in which the head was continually linked with divine animals, martial force, and supernatural protection. Some bronze fittings from vessels make this especially clear. Human heads appear as handle mounts or escutcheons on buckets and ceremonial containers, connected with elite burial or ritual feasting. Their broad brows, set mouths, and stylized hair place them fully within the native tradition. These vessels were likely used in important communal or sacred settings before entering the grave. The heads on them therefore carried meaning beyond ornament. They turned an object used in ritual consumption into something watched over by a sacred or protective presence. One especially unusual bronze from southern Britain combines a human head with a bird body. The human face is set into the back of a goose or similar bird, and the symbolism is extraordinary, but not isolated. Across Celtic tradition, birds of war and the human head are closely linked. Sacred birds accompany battle goddesses. Heads of the slain are imagined as belonging to them. In that context, a bronze object joining bird and face begins to make sense. It may look strange to modern eyes, but within Celtic symbolism it belongs to a familiar world where war, death, and divine appetite overlap. The sacred head also appears on ritual regalia. A bronze crown from eastern Britain, found with other ceremonial pieces, is decorated with a series of male masks at the points where the arched elements meet the headband. Their eyes are elongated, their hair and beards are stylized, and their mouths are set in the usual grave expression. These are not portraits. They seem more likely to represent divine or cultic faces placed on an object worn either by a priest or by a cult image. Another object, a bronze strip from a sanctuary staff or scepter, shows a human head paired with a wheel. That combination is deeply meaningful. The head, the wheel, and the sacred staff all belong to the same broad world of ritual symbolism and divine force. There are also smaller bronze heads, whose purpose is less certain but whose style remains unmistakably native. Some may have served as caps, mounts, or weights. Others were found in wells, pools, or temple sites. A tiny bronze head recovered from a sacred well in the north, together with a human skull and other offerings, is particularly striking. Even at that small scale, the shape and expression still carry the full power of the old tradition. The sacred head did not need to be monumental to matter. It could function just as effectively in miniature, as long as it carried the right symbolic charge. A related group includes the Romano-British masks. These differ from full heads because many seem to have been attached to wooden backings, perhaps fixed, to cult figures or ritual furniture. Several British examples belong to a wider tradition also found in Gaul. One of the most important was recovered from the drain associated with the baths at Bath. Made of tin, flat and fairly heavy, it clearly once formed part of a larger object, probably wooden. Its hair, eyes, and facial lines belong fully to the Celtic visual world, even though it comes from a setting already shaped by Roman sacred architecture. Another bronze mask from Somerset shows the same combination of native style and Roman age context. The eyes were once filled with glass, or a similar material, and the face still holds that familiar combination of stillness and intensity. More bronze masks come from eastern Britain. Some were hollow cast. Some were originally fixed to staffs or scepters. One appears to wear a torque and is therefore almost certainly divine rather than human. Another is so decorative in the treatment of curls and beard that it could easily be mistaken for a classical object at first glance, yet the style remains Celtic underneath. A female bronze head from the south also belongs here, with its large elongated eyes and pebble insets. Its form suggests an object meant to be seen frontally and perhaps carried or displayed rather than simply stored away. What unites these masks is the sense that the face remained central to ritual display. It could appear on wood, on bronze, on staff tops, or on ceremonial figures. But its role was the same. It made sacred presence visible. Another major form in which the head appears is the antefix, the decorated tile fixed to the edge of a roof. These were Roman in origin, but in Britain they quickly became a vehicle for local religious imagery. Their placement made them ideal protective symbols. Positioned high on buildings, they watched outward and guarded the structure beneath them. In this role, the Celtic severed head and the classical gorgon could easily converge. Both were charged with apotropaic force. Both were meant to repel danger. As a result, antefixes from Roman Britain sometimes preserve deeply native symbolism in a Roman architectural format. The finest series comes from Caerleon in South Wales. There, several triangular roof tiles carry human heads in bold relief. Some show radiate male faces with cat-like ears, wheels, stars, and sacred trees. These details are extremely suggestive. The cat-eared head in particular may preserve the memory of a local feline deity or supernatural being whose echoes survived later in Welsh legend. These images are not random fantasy. They appear repeatedly enough to suggest a coherent cult language. Another tile from the same site shows a stark human face surrounded by trees, again pointing to the fusion of sacred head, sacred grove, and divine presence. Elsewhere in Britain, antefixes show male heads with little horns, stylized hair, or leaf-like crowns. One from Dorset is especially early and shows a bearded horned face in powerful relief. Another, from Gloucestershire, crowns the human head with stylized foliage, creating a direct link between the sacred face and the divine tree. Even when the tile itself is Roman in function, the imagery remains fully local. York has produced another related series, this time showing female busts in terracotta. They seem to belong to the same broad family of protective roof imagery, though with a somewhat different local emphasis. Again, the key point is continuity. Roman Britain adopted an architectural form from the Mediterranean world, but filled it with figures and meanings that still belonged to Celtic religion. The head also appears frequently on pottery. This matters because pottery often preserves beliefs that were woven into daily or communal practice, rather than reserved for grand temple art alone. In the north, especially around Carlisle, several vessels are decorated with remarkable faces. One large pot bears a male head with circular eyes, strong beard and moustache, and a decorated crown-like band around the head. The expression is stern and focused. It does not look like table decoration. It looks ritual. Another vessel from the same general region carries multiple heads and a bust, while a further example may show a female face with an elaborate headdress. A vase from Corbridge also bears a striking bearded male head. These were likely used in cult settings, feasting, libation, or other practices where the vessel itself became part of the ritual action. Beyond these, there is a broader class of face pots, or face urns. These have a long history in Europe and remained popular in Roman Britain. Some may have belonged to fertility rites, especially where a phallic motif appears below the face. That pairing is important because it returns again to the old Celtic association between the head and generative force. A mould for a face vessel from near Oxford shows this tradition still active in the late Roman period. Interestingly, although it was meant to produce a classical female face, the outer side of the mould was reshaped into a grotesque male mask by the local potter. That small act says a great deal. It shows that even when classical forms were available, the native instinct to create the sacred or uncanny face remained strong. Other face pots from places like Colchester show crude clay faces added by hand, some even with little horns rising from the brow. These are not elegant pieces. They likely belong to a more popular and rough-edged level of cult practice. Their expressions are often sullen, menacing, or coarse rather than noble. Yet they are no less important for that. They show that the sacred face was not only a high cult image of gods and shrines. It also belonged to the ordinary religious life of people who wanted objects with protective, fertile, or unsettling force in their homes, graves, or local rites. Many more heads must once have existed in wood. This is one of the great losses in trying to reconstruct Celtic religion. Stone and bronze survive. Wood mostly does not. Yet there is enough evidence from Gaul and Britain to show that wooden heads were certainly made. A single surviving example from Sussex, carved on a pointed oak stake, preserves just enough to prove that this was once a real and probably widespread tradition. The features are entirely Celtic in style. That one survival hints at a much larger vanished world of wooden cult heads, fixed to stakes, posts, shrines, or ritual enclosures. The sacred head also had a special relationship with water. This is one of the most revealing aspects of the whole cult. The Celts revered springs, wells, pools, and rivers, with extraordinary consistency, and these places continued to hold sacred importance even after Christianity arrived. In that wider water cult, the human head appears again and again. The connection is too frequent to be accidental. The clearest case comes from the famous well dedicated to a local goddess in the north. Among the many offerings recovered from it were bronze heads and a human skull. On its own, that skull might seem puzzling, but once the wider pattern is recognised, its meaning becomes much more plausible. Sacred wells in Roman Britain sometimes contain not only coins, pins, figurines, and pottery, but also human skulls. This is not a one-off curiosity. It belongs to a repeated ritual habit in which the sacred head and sacred water were brought together deliberately. Other wells in Britain have yielded similar combinations. At one site, a mounted warrior figure, a shield fitting, pottery, and a woman's skull were found together at the bottom of a well. Elsewhere, wells have produced pottery, bones, and human crania in arrangements that strongly suggest ritual deposition rather than casual disposal. A comparable pattern is found farther north in Denmark, where wells associated with enclosed ritual areas also contained human and animal remains. Such parallels do not prove direct identity of belief, but they do show that placing skulls in sacred water belonged to a broader northern ritual mentality, in which water acted as a threshold and a receiving place for charged offerings. Caves and underground pools continue the same idea. In one great cave pool in Somerset, numerous human skulls were recovered along with Romano-British pottery. Most of the skulls belong to young adults, and the associated material dates them to the Roman period. It is possible to imagine many explanations for how human heads ended up in such a place, but within the known framework of Celtic religion, ritual deposition is by far the most persuasive. The combination of sacred water, pottery offerings, and human skulls fits too well with what is already known from wells and shrines. The archaeological evidence makes it much easier to trust the later stories. Once it becomes clear that skulls and severed heads really were placed in wells, springs, and sacred waters in the Celtic world, the literary traditions stop looking like fantasy and begin to feel like echoes of an older religious memory. In Celtic legend and folklore, the meeting of the severed head and the sacred well appears again and again. The pattern is too consistent to be accidental. It belongs to a long-lived sacred idea in which water was not just a natural feature, but a place of power, and the head was not just a remnant of the body, but a vessel of force, speech, and lasting presence. Welsh tradition preserves traces of this connection in a striking way. In some places, the skull itself was believed to guard the well. The idea is simple but revealing. The well is protected, watched over, or made powerful by the presence of a human head. In Scottish Gaelic tradition, a similar belief survived into modern times. Water taken from a spring and drunk from the skull of an ancestor was thought to carry healing force, especially in cases of epilepsy. That belief may sound extraordinary today, but it preserves exactly the kind of sacred logic that runs through earlier Celtic material. The power lies not only in the spring and not only in the skull, but in their union. Sacred water and ancestral head together create a remedy stronger than either one alone. Early Irish tradition preserves this pattern even more clearly. The place legends of Ireland, stories, told to explain why a hill, a spring, or a river bore a certain name, are full of old religious memory, hidden inside local narrative. Again and again, a severed head is connected with a well, and the water reacts as if it has absorbed the event. In one story, a young man is beheaded beside a spring on a hill. His head is thrown into the well, and from that moment the water changes. For part of the year it runs sweet and clear. For another part it becomes bitter and salty. The well has taken in violence, and its nature has been altered by it. In another tale, 3 men are killed beside a spring, their heads cast into the water. Elsewhere, a woman is slain beside a well, her body laid in the water while her head is raised on a stake nearby in full accordance with Celtic custom. The result is the same. The place is transformed, marked forever by the union of blood, head, and water. Some stories go even further, making the well itself dangerous once severed heads have entered it. In one legend, the heads of slain warriors are brought to a spring in a glen. The survivor, realizing that the water has become charged with destructive force, tries to contain it by building a strong structure over the source. It fails. The spring erupts in fury and drowns a great number of people, including the very man who tried to control it. In another story, hundreds of enemy heads are cast into a lake after battle, and the water turns red with blood. The place then takes its name from the heads. In these tales, the water is not passive. It reacts. It answers desecration, violence, and sacrifice. This is entirely in keeping with the wider Celtic idea that wells and springs were living thresholds, capable of blessing or punishing depending on what was done beside them. This old religious connection did not vanish when Christianity spread. Instead, it often passed into the legends of saints, where the holy head takes over the role once held by the sacred severed head of pagan story. One of the clearest examples comes from the legend of a saint from Cornwall and Brittany. After he is murdered and decapitated, his killer carries the head away. On the journey, overcome by thirst and near death, the murderer cries out for help. The severed head then speaks and instructs him to fix his staff into the earth. When he does so, a spring bursts forth, and the staff takes root and becomes a beautiful tree. In a single moment, the old Celtic pattern appears again in Christian clothing. The speaking head, the life-giving spring, and the sacred tree all emerge together. Nothing could show more clearly how persistent this older religious structure remained beneath the new faith. The same saint's legend emphasizes that the head itself continued to possess a special force after death. His body and head are buried in separate places, and the head acts almost independently, moving with intention and retaining power of its own. Healing wells linked with this saint became famous afterward. What matters here is not simply the miracle story, but the shape of it. A severed head creates a spring. A head remains active after death. A healing cult grows around the water. These are not random details. They belong to an old pattern that Christianity absorbed rather than erased. A similar tradition survived in France at ancient healing springs that had almost certainly been sacred long before Christianity. There too, a martyr's severed head is linked to the sudden appearance of a spring. In Wales, the same structure appears once again. One saint is beheaded, and her head rolls down the hill until it comes to rest upon a rock, from which a clear spring immediately begins to flow. Another saint loses his head beside a well, and the spring dries up as though the water itself responds to the violence. In these stories, holy wells do not merely happen to exist beside the death of a saint. The head and the water are intimately bound together. The well either comes into being, changes its nature, or reveals its power through the intervention of the severed head. A striking parallel even appears in Norse tradition, where the severed head of a wise being is preserved, treated with herbs, and kept beside a sacred well. The head retains speech and prophetic knowledge, whispering secrets to the god who consults it. The whole sequence feels remarkably close to the Celtic world. The cutting of the head, its preservation, its power of speech, and its connection with a holy spring. Whether this came through direct borrowing or through prolonged contact with Celtic ideas, the resemblance is too strong to ignore. The sacred head beside the well is not a minor detail. It is a full religious complex. Even later, folk tradition preserves the same structure in surprisingly vivid form. In one early modern dramatic scene rooted in older story material, a woman goes to the well of life and encounters a head rising from the water. It speaks, asks to be combed and tended, and promises reward. When mistreated, it responds with storm, thunder, and disruption. Later, more heads rise from the well, one bringing grain, another wealth. Every major element of the older Celtic complex is present here. The head in the well speaks. It has fertility power. It grants abundance. It is tied to marriage symbolism, prosperity, and the life force of the land. The detail of combing the head is especially telling, because in Irish heroic material, the savoured head of an important figure is washed, dressed, and arranged before speaking or receiving offerings. Care for the head is part of the ritual. The same tradition survived deep into Gaelic oral culture. In the Hebrides and the Highlands, stories were still being told about wells named for heads, and about heads that spoke, prophesied, or gave a place its sacred identity. On one island, 3 brothers are killed at a well. Their father retrieves the heads, and as he carries them away, one of them begins to speak when he reaches a standing stone. The head makes prophecies, including the promise that a child not yet born will one day avenge the deaths. Years later, the prophecy comes true. The murderer is lured back to the same well and decapitated there. His head remains in the water, and the place becomes known as the Well of the Head. This is an extraordinary survival. The head speaks, it prophesies, it acts through time. The well preserves the memory and the power of the event. Another Highland story tells of severed heads carried in a basket that become restless and clash together until they are taken out and washed in a spring. The spring is then named from the heads. Elsewhere on Skye, wells, lochs, and even a fish weir carry names linked to severed heads because local memory attached stories of murder, battle, vengeance, and washing of heads to those places. In one version, a brigand cuts off his own son's head and throws it into a well. In another, a cruel official is beheaded beside a spring, and his head is washed in its water. In yet another, heads of defeated warriors roll down into a loch after battle, giving it its name. These stories are often told now as local history or rough legend, but beneath them lies the older sacred pattern. The people may no longer remember the cult meaning, yet the structure survives. The head, the water, the naming of the place, and the sense that the event leaves a permanent charge in the landscape. This continuity is one of the strongest arguments for the deep antiquity of the cult. The association of sacred heads with sacred waters did not survive only in one country or one text. It appears in Ireland, Wales, Brittany, Scotland, and even in related northern traditions beyond the Celtic world. It persists through pagan myth, saints' legend, local folklore, and place names. That is exactly what should be expected from a belief with real ritual force in the ancient world. Archaeology shows that skulls were placed in wells. Tradition shows that heads in wells could speak, heal, curse, name a landscape, or create springs. The two bodies of evidence illuminate each other perfectly. This brings the discussion naturally to the problem of Irish iconography. Ireland preserves an enormous number of carved heads, but dating them is far more difficult than in Britain or Gaul. There is no clear Roman layer to help separate pre-Christian from later work. As a result, many Irish heads can only be judged by style, and style alone is not always enough. Some are plainly early, others are deeply archaic in appearance but may belong to the Christian period. That uncertainty makes classification difficult, but it also reveals something valuable. The sacred significance of the head in Ireland lasted for an astonishingly long time. Even when the original pagan cult faded, the symbol remained alive and powerful. Heads continued to appear in religious and architectural settings, because the image still meant something profound. That continuity does not weaken the case for the cult of the head in Ireland. It strengthens it. Some might argue that because dating is difficult, the early Irish material cannot prove the pre-Christian importance of the symbol. But the literary evidence makes that impossible. Irish narrative tradition is full of severed heads that speak, move, sing, or continue to act after death. The head in Ireland was unquestionably a charged and sacred object. The difficulty lies not in proving that, but in deciding which carved examples belong to which stage of that long tradition. A few Irish heads can be treated with relative confidence as early. The triple head from Cavan is one of the strongest examples. Its style, expression, and find place all point toward an Iron Age origin. Another head from Armagh has the same unmistakable early force, with its simplified features and archaic treatment of the face. Other heads from Donegal and elsewhere likewise seem to belong to the old world of Celtic cult. Yet beyond these clear cases lies a much larger and more confusing body of material. Some heads appear on church buildings, crosses, and later religious structures, yet still look unmistakably pagan in feeling. In those cases, Christianity did not create a new symbol. It inherited an older one and reused it. That is why any serious study of Irish heads would require a full corpus and careful comparison. Only by assembling them all, with photographs, provenance, stylistic analysis, and contextual evidence, could a reliable internal chronology begin to emerge. And once that was done, comparison with Britain, Gaul, and even Scandinavia would become much easier. Denmark presents similar difficulties. There too, scholars face a body of iconography in which the human head survives, over a long period, with some objects clearly early and others preserved in later settings. There is no Roman provincial sequence there either, which makes dating difficult in much the same way as in Ireland. The resemblance is important. Both countries preserve signs of a deeply rooted symbolic tradition, in which the head retained apotropaic and sacred force long after its original cult setting had changed. That is why the Irish and Danish material deserve to be considered together. Not because they are identical, but because both show the same stubborn endurance of the sacred head as an image. Even later European tradition offers smaller, but still revealing signs of continuity. In one Breton cathedral, skulls of churchmen were preserved and shown to visitors. Elsewhere in Britain, painted pebbles marked with grotesque human faces were used in houses as protective objects, believed to keep evil away from ovens and domestic spaces. Such examples belong to a much later world, yet they preserve the same basic instinct. The human face, even in reduced or transformed form, still carried protective power. All of this makes the documentary evidence for the cult of the head especially valuable. Archaeology can show where skulls were placed and where carved heads were set up, but literature and folklore show how those heads were understood. They reveal the head as prophetic, protective, dangerous, fertile, and alive with force. The old Welsh and Irish stories, though written down centuries after conversion, still preserve enough of the pre-Christian imagination to make the meaning of the symbol unmistakable. The most famous example comes from Welsh tradition in the story of Bran. He is a giant heroic figure whose very size marks him as more than ordinary, perhaps preserving the memory of a god reduced into legend. After a disastrous conflict in Ireland, he is mortally wounded and orders his companions to cut off his head and carry it with them. What follows is one of the most extraordinary head legends in European tradition. The severed head remains alive, speaking, giving counsel, and accompanying the survivors through years of feasting and wandering. It is not a burden. It is a source of company, wisdom, and delight. It presides over a long suspension of grief and time itself, as though the head still contains the life of the whole being. At the end of its journey, the head is buried in London in a hidden place, and as long as it remains there, the island is safe from invasion and plague. The meaning is unmistakable. This is not simply a heroic relic. It is a protective sacred head whose concealed presence guards a land. The old Celtic understanding survives here almost untouched. The head lives on after the body. It speaks, it blesses, it protects territory. It acts as a talisman for an entire people. This Welsh legend is extraordinarily important because it says openly what the carved heads, temple finds, and ritual deposits only suggest in fragments. Bran is not presented as an ordinary man, even in the form preserved by medieval storytelling. His scale, his role, and the powers of his severed head all point back to something much older than heroic fiction. The tale feels like a reshaped memory of a sacred head that once belonged to a divine being and once presided over a supernatural feast. In that sense, the story preserves almost the whole religious meaning of the Celtic cult of the head in narrative form. The head is not dead matter. It remains active, aware, and powerful. It protects the land, keeps enemies away, gives prophecy, and presides over abundance, companionship, and the suspension of sorrow. Everything the archaeological material implies about the sacred status of the head is made fully visible here. The powers of Bran's head are exactly the powers most often attached to the head in Celtic tradition. It is apotropaic because its burial protects the island from invasion. It is divine because it does not merely survive after death, but continues to function as a source of order and blessing. It belongs to the world of the feast beyond ordinary time, where need disappears and grief is held at bay. It is prophetic because it knows what will happen and directs the survivors accordingly. Even the name attached to Bran in the later tradition may preserve a disguised trace of something earlier, as though a Christian reinterpretation had settled over a much older, sacred title. The legend, therefore, does more than entertain. It preserves a theological image. It shows the severed head as a concentration of divine force, exactly in line with what the wider Celtic material suggests. Irish literature contains another, more indirect but equally suggestive glimpse of actual reverence shown to a severed head. In one tale of war and kingship, the defeated warrior's head is taken and treated with extraordinary honour. It is washed, carefully arranged, braided and covered with fine cloth. Then cooked animals are set out before it, in what can only be described as an offering or ceremonial meal. The head responds. It blushes, opens its eyes, and gives thanks for the honour shown to it. The Christian colouring of the scene cannot hide its deeper strangeness. This is not ordinary mourning. It is not just respect for a fallen enemy. It is an image of the head receiving offerings and answering as though it were still fully present. The feast laid before it strongly recalls the older image of the sacred head presiding over, or participating in, ritual abundance. In narrative form, this is very close to worship. The same story strengthens the old connection between the severed head and the battle goddess. When the honoured head is displayed, the war raven circles it in triumph. This detail matters because the head is not simply being remembered. It is entering the supernatural space of battlefield divinity, where birds of death, triumph, and prophecy gather. That union of sacred head and warbird belongs to one of the oldest patterns in Celtic religion. The head is the spoil of battle, but it is also more than spoil. It has become an object with presence enough to attract the powers that haunt the battlefield. A second episode from the same broad tradition makes the old belief even clearer. A young singer is decapitated in battle after promising that he will sing for his lord that night, no matter what happens. Later, as one of the victors walks among the bodies to take trophies, the severed heads begin singing on the field. The sweetest voice of all belongs to the young singer, who refuses at first to sing for anyone except the Lord to whom he made his promise. Eventually, his head is carried away, placed on a pillar at the feast, and asked to sing. It turns toward the wall, away from the light, and then sings so beautifully that everyone weeps. Afterward, it is returned to the battlefield. This is one of the most revealing head legends in the entire insular tradition. The head survives, keeps its promise, chooses its audience, expresses emotion, and performs in a ritual setting. The pillar is especially striking because the placement of severed heads on stones or stakes is fully in keeping with known Celtic custom. What looks like marvel in the tale is probably preserving real patterns of older belief. Other Irish stories continue the same theme. In one Fenian tale, the severed head of a murdered fool protests from beside the fire because it is not given a share of the food. It speaks more than once, even after being thrust outside. The idea is the same. The head remains socially and spiritually present. In another story, the severed head of a slain lover sings a poem to the woman who holds it, lamenting its fate and giving final instructions. The emotional tone may vary from tale to tale, but the underlying belief remains stable. The head is still alive in the meaningful sense. It can speak, feel, remember, instruct, and react. The same is true of the old warrior Connell and the traditions attached to his enemies and his own severed head. One enemy head is said to be so vast that it could hold multiple men or game pieces within it, which marks it as more than human and pushes it toward the sphere of the supernatural giant or divine being. A prophecy says that a whole region will recover its strength by drinking milk from it. That detail is especially important because it links the severed head not only with power and survival, but with nourishment and restoration. Elsewhere, a severed head set upon a stone moves from its place, travels ahead to a river, and changes colour as if responding emotionally to the words spoken over it. Once again, the head is no lifeless object. It perceives, answers, and behaves as if the person's force is still fully concentrated within it. The Irish tradition also preserves multiple headed beings, and these are particularly revealing because they connect the sacred head with the otherworld and with destructive divine powers. One three-headed monster is said to emerge at the dangerous threshold of the year, devastating the land until a hero destroys it. Another being has two heads on a single neck and must be overcome in violent combat before its head is impaled on a stake. There is also a four-headed figure attached to old place legend and heroic tradition. These creatures may appear at first glance to belong to fantasy alone, but their recurrence suggests memory of real cult types. The triple and multiple head was already a meaningful way of expressing divinity in Celtic iconography. In the stories, that same sacred form survives, though often transformed into something monstrous by later storytelling. Another tale, focused on the death of a king, preserves a different but equally old pattern. The king is decapitated and water is poured into the mouth of the severed head. The head then speaks. That detail is remarkable because it draws together two of the most persistent sacred themes in the Celtic world: the speaking severed head and the animating force of water. The same union appears in the stories of heads in wells, healing springs brought forth by severed heads, and heads that react to or transform water. In this story, water restores speech to the head, as if the otherworldly force carried by the severed head could be awakened again by the sacred element with which it was so often associated. All these stories make one point again and again. For the insular Celts, the severed head was not imagined as a dead remainder. It continued to hold personality, force, dignity, magical power, memory, and prophecy. That old belief also survives in later folk narrative, where the setting may have become more popular or fantastic, but the underlying structure remains the same. In one Scottish Gaelic tale, a king sees a head coming toward him surrounded by fire. The head humiliates him publicly and returns year after year. The imagery is altered into wonder tale form, but the old sacred signs are still there. The autonomous head, the supernatural fire, the continuing active presence. Another Highland tale speaks of a headless ghost whose severed head becomes a weapon of supernatural violence. The head is thrown at travellers and kills them until someone is brave enough to reunite it with the body under strict conditions. This belongs to a much later stratum of storytelling, yet it still shows how deeply the idea of the active, severed head remained embedded in Gaelic imagination. Even in ghost story form, the head is still treated as the decisive centre of force. When all the evidence is brought together, the overall pattern becomes unmistakable. Across Celtic Britain and Ireland, the human head was treated as the supreme bodily symbol of power. It was the seat of life, the container of identity, the bearer of divine force, and the point at which the human and the supernatural most easily met. This was not a marginal idea and not merely a war custom. It was one of the most central and most persistent elements in Celtic religion. It appears in battle practice, in shrine decoration, in wells and springs, in funerary material, in carved stone, in metalwork, and in literature from heroic saga down to local folktale. The Celts were therefore far more than simple headhunters. They certainly took heads in war, displayed them, and honoured them as trophies. But that is only the outer layer of the practice. The reverence shown to the head reached far beyond military pride. The head appears in domestic, ritual, artistic, mythological, and healing contexts. It could guard, prophesy, nourish, heal, terrify, and bless. It belonged as much to the feast as to the battlefield, as much to the sacred spring as to the gate of a fortress. No other symbol moves so freely through every level of Celtic life. This veneration clearly had older roots in Britain and Europe before the Celts themselves emerged as a distinct people. But the Celts took that older inheritance and turned it into something unusually rich and systematic. They made the severed head one of their most recognisable religious signs. The classical writers noticed it. Archaeology confirms it. The insular stories explain it from within. Each source supports the others. Taken together, they show a people for whom the head was not just a part of the body, but the body's most sacred concentration of force. Roman Britain adds another layer to the picture. Under Roman influence, native artists began carving and shaping heads in ways informed by provincial classical style. Yet they never surrendered the older intensity of the symbol. The heads remain unmistakably local in mood and function. Some have multiple faces, some bear horns or animal ears. Some have cup-shaped hollows in the crown, suggesting ritual use. Some wear torsks, identifying them as divine. Others are placed on phallic stones or appear in contexts where fertility, protection, and death overlap. In many cases, these heads probably stood for unnamed local gods. Their anonymity is itself significant. Among the Celts, the sacred name carried force and powerful symbols were not always meant to be labelled. The image could be enough. It is also clear that the Celtic severed head and the classical Gorgon head were close enough in meaning to merge naturally in some settings. Both were apotropaic. Both could be tied to healing waters. Both could be used on temples, buildings, and protective objects. The Great Head at Bath is the clearest example of this blending. Roman and native visual language meet there without cancelling one another. The result is a new form, but the old Celtic understanding of the head remains alive within it. The literary evidence strengthens everything that the carved and deposited material already suggests. The story of Bran is especially decisive because it shows the sacred head performing openly what archaeology can only hint at: protecting territory, presiding over a supernatural feast, predicting the future, sustaining those around it, and continuing to act long after bodily death. Irish tradition adds detail after detail that fits the same system. Severed heads are washed, dressed, offered food, made to sing, propped on stones or stakes, associated with birds of war, linked to wells, and treated as beings still fully charged with power. Of all the known aspects of this cult, the bond between the severed head and sacred water may be the best documented. Archaeology, saint legend, place lore, heroic narrative, and modern folklore all preserve it. The same deep structure appears across centuries. The head enters the well, changes the spring, creates it, protects it, or speaks beside it. Few elements of Celtic religion show such strong and continuous survival. The severed head, then, stands at the centre of Celtic symbolic life. It is perhaps the single clearest image through which Celtic religion tried to express divinity and the powers of the otherworld. Fertility, wisdom, prophecy, healing, hospitality, protection, and martial strength all gather around it. Once that is understood, much else in Celtic belief becomes easier to read. Even puzzling archaeological patterns begin to make more sense. If, for example, a site yields many heads from broken statues, but very few matching bodies, one possible explanation is that the heads were preserved or displayed deliberately. In a culture that treated the severed head as the most powerful part, saving the head while the rest was destroyed would not be strange at all. It would be entirely in keeping with one of the oldest and most enduring religious instincts of the Celtic world. Among all the religious ideas found in the Celtic world, the reverence for the human head stands out as the most persistent and deeply rooted. It does not exist in isolation. Instead, it connects with almost every other belief system the Celts developed. Once the head is understood as a sacred centre of power, many other cults begin to make more sense, especially those involving divine figures that combine human and animal traits. One of the most important of these is the worship of a horned god, a figure that appears again and again across Celtic lands, second only in significance to the cult of the head itself. This horned god did not suddenly appear in Celtic religion. Its origins stretch far back into prehistoric Europe, long before the emergence of distinct Celtic identity. In the Bronze Age, figures with horns already symbolised strength, fertility, and control over nature. Rock carvings and metal objects from Northern Europe show powerful beings, with exaggerated horns, often carrying weapons or standing within symbolic environments such as ships. These images are not random decorations. They reflect a long-standing belief that horns represented vitality, dominance, and a connection to forces beyond the human world. In many of these early images, the horned figure is closely linked with water. Ships, rivers, and marine symbols frequently accompany these deities, suggesting that fertility and life-giving power were connected to both land and water. This connection continues into later Celtic traditions, where horned gods are sometimes associated with rivers, springs, or even anchors and maritime symbols. The idea is consistent. This is not just a god of animals, but a god tied to the broader cycles of life and nature. Animals play a central role in this imagery. The stag, the bull, and the ram are especially important, and their horns or antlers are emphasized again and again. Sometimes these features appear in exaggerated or unnatural ways. Animals may have 3 horns instead of 2, or horns may end in rounded shapes rather than sharp points. Even creatures that do not naturally have horns are sometimes depicted with them. This is not artistic confusion. It is symbolic language. Horns are being used to represent power itself, not just the anatomy of a specific animal. In some cases, these horns end in rounded knobs, a detail that appears repeatedly in both animal and human representations. While it might seem practical to explain this as a way of reducing danger, the context suggests something deeper. These are sacred images, not everyday tools. The rounded horn tips likely carried symbolic meaning, possibly connected to fertility or ritual transformation. The same kind of symbolic exaggeration appears in references to magical objects in early traditions, where gold ornaments or shining spheres are described as part of divine or supernatural equipment. Over time, these animal features begin to merge with human forms. The result is the horned god, a figure that is both human and animal, combining intelligence with raw natural force. Sometimes the god has antlers, like a stag. Sometimes he has the horns of a bull or a ram. In other cases, animal traits, such as ears or hooves, appear alongside human features. The boundaries are deliberately blurred. This is a being that stands between worlds, not confined to a single form. One of the earliest clear depictions of this figure in a recognizably Celtic setting comes from northern Italy, where a horned deity is shown standing, wearing a neck ornament associated with power and status. Nearby appears a smaller human figure, clearly marked by exaggerated sexual features. This contrast highlights an important theme. The horned god is not just powerful, but deeply connected to fertility. Even when the god himself is not explicitly shown as sexualized, the symbolism around him makes the connection unmistakable. As time passes, this figure becomes more defined, especially in the artistic traditions of Celtic Europe. He appears seated in a distinctive posture, often cross-legged, surrounded by animals. This position is not accidental. It suggests control, balance, and authority. The animals around him are not random either. They respond to him, gather around him, or simply exist within his domain. He is not hunting them. He is ruling over them. This idea is echoed in later storytelling traditions. In one tale, a giant figure sits at the center of a wild landscape surrounded by animals of every kind. With a single action, he summons them, and they respond as if obeying a master. This scene closely mirrors the visual representations of the horned god found in earlier art. Even though the story has been reshaped over time, the core idea remains intact. A powerful being who commands the natural world. In other depictions, the horned god is not only a ruler of animals, but also a giver of wealth and prosperity. He is shown holding objects that pour out abundance, suggesting that he controls not just wildlife, but also material fortune. In this form, he stands alongside other divine figures associated with trade, healing, and protection. This flexibility shows how adaptable the god was. He could take on different roles depending on local beliefs, without losing his essential identity. The serpent often appears alongside him, especially a distinctive form with features of both snake and ram. This creature is not a minor detail. It is one of the most consistent symbols connected to the horned god. In some cases, the god holds the serpent. In others, the serpent wraps around him or even replaces parts of his body. The two are inseparable, suggesting a deep symbolic relationship. The serpent may represent regeneration, hidden knowledge, or the connection between earth and water. In Britain, evidence for this horned god becomes especially clear during the Roman period, although it likely existed earlier. Carvings and objects show figures with antlers or horns, often seated and accompanied by serpents or animals. In some cases, the god's lower body transforms into serpents, merging human and animal forms into a single being. These images are complex and sometimes difficult to interpret, but they consistently point toward the same underlying belief system. There are also signs that this god was known across different regions, though not always in exactly the same form. In southern areas, he appears more closely aligned with continental traditions, possibly introduced or influenced by migrations and cultural exchange. In northern regions, a slightly different version emerges, often associated with pastoral life and local traditions. These variations suggest that the idea of the horned god was flexible, adapting to different environments and communities. Even in later periods, after Christianity had spread, traces of this figure remained. In some carvings, a horned figure still appears, surrounded by animals or holding them in a gesture of control. However, the meaning begins to shift. What was once a symbol of divine power may now be interpreted as something darker, even associated with evil. This transformation shows how older beliefs were not erased, but reinterpreted within a new religious framework. The persistence of this imagery is striking. It appears in early carvings, continues through Roman-influenced art, and survives into medieval contexts. Even when the original meaning is no longer fully understood, the image remains powerful enough to be reused and reimagined. This suggests that the horned god was not a minor or localized figure, but a central element of Celtic religious thought. When placed alongside the cult of the head, the significance of this figure becomes even clearer. Both represent attempts to express power, life, and the connection between the human and the supernatural. The head concentrates identity and spirit, while the horns represent strength, fertility, and dominance over nature. Together, they form a system of symbols that defined how the Celts understood the world around them. In Gaul, the antlered god is almost always shown alone. A female partner is rarely, if ever, given a clear place beside him. The same pattern appears in Britain. Both the stag-crowned god of the south and the horned pastoral god of the north usually stand without a consort as self-contained powers. Yet there are a few hints that a female counterpart, or at least a related divine form, was known at the edges of this tradition. One fragment of local pottery from Richborough shows the bust of a horned woman, her breasts marked out in simple raised clay. The image is rough, but the intention is clear. Somewhere in the background of the horned god's world, a horned goddess also existed. Another small bronze figure, probably connected with Belgic influence and perhaps imported from Gaul, shows a squatting female divinity with antlers, holding a dish in one hand and a horn of plenty in the other. Even if that figure did not originate in Britain, its presence still matters. It suggests that the idea of a female horned power was not alien to the religious imagination of the Celtic West. Literary tradition offers only the faintest shadow of such beings. There are occasional references to horned women in Irish tale, but they never emerge as a major cult form. Horns remain overwhelmingly a male sign, linked with strength, wilderness, kingship, and dangerous fertility. Even so, one Welsh figure may preserve a distant echo of the older stag god. Morfran, son of Tegid, is described as so ugly and uncanny that warriors at Camlan took him for a devil. His hair was said to be like that of a stag. That detail is brief, almost casual, but it carries weight. Christian tradition regularly pushed older pagan figures downward into the realm of demons, monsters, and frightening outcasts. When a figure marked by stag-like attributes is mistaken for a devil, it becomes difficult not to suspect that some memory of an older horned or antlered cult figure survives beneath the later storytelling. In Ireland, traces of a god comparable to the Gaulish antlered lord are far more difficult to pin down than in Roman Britain. The problem is not the complete absence of evidence, but the difficulty of dating it. Ireland did not pass through a Roman provincial phase, so there is no clear archaeological layer by which pagan and later Christian representations can easily be separated. The style of Irish carving is often archaic for centuries, and early forms continue stubbornly into medieval church art. That makes certainty nearly impossible. Yet once the wider Celtic evidence is understood, the Irish material begins to look much less isolated. If a horned or antlered god was so deeply rooted in Gaul and Britain, and if so many other core Celtic divine types can still be recognised in Irish story after Christian reshaping, it would be surprising if this god alone had vanished without leaving any trace. That possibility becomes even stronger when considering the nature of the cult itself. This was a figure of fertility, animal increase, hidden wealth, wilderness, and enduring supernatural power. A god of that kind would have been especially vulnerable to Christian hostility. Any cult bound so tightly to animal fecundity, virility, and dangerous sacred power would have drawn strong suspicion from the church. In some later visual traditions, the old squatting horned god seems to have become one of the models for the Christian image of Satan. Horned, crouching, serpent-linked, and defiantly pagan in appearance. If that is true, then direct memory of the original cult would have been actively suppressed. What survives would naturally be fragmentary, disguised, or preserved only in altered forms. Even so, enough remains to suggest that Ireland too knew a god very close to, and perhaps identical with, the antlered divinity of Gaul. Some of the strongest clues come from the north of Ireland, especially the region between Armagh and Lough Erne, where several monuments of unmistakably pagan feeling have survived. One striking figure now preserved at Armagh was reportedly found in bogland near Newry. It is small, less than 2 feet high, with an oversized head and a body that ends abruptly at the hips in the old Celtic manner. The arms are withered and simplified, the hands coarse, the pose rigid and unnatural. Yet the most revealing detail is the head. What might at first look like a cap or helmet proves on closer examination to be a brow line and cranial form from which 2 small but undeniable horns emerge. The face is severe, the eyes round and close set, the mouth large and open beneath a moustache. This is not Christian naturalism. It belongs to the world of cult image and divine sign. It has close visual kinship with horned continental figures of clearly pagan type. Another powerful example comes from Boa Island. That stone is better known for its doubled form and enigmatic expression, but it also belongs to the same larger field of imagery. The body is tiny and secondary, while the head dominates everything. The pose below suggests the same crouched attitude often associated with the horned god. The figure is almost flat and 2-dimensional, like a piece of La Tène metalwork translated into stone. There are hints that the larger form may once have been more explicitly double or horned, before later damage altered it. Even in its present state, it fits naturally into the same cultic tradition as the horned figures of Britain and Gaul. A head from Armagh adds another suggestive detail. Earlier it was considered mainly in connection with the cult of the head, but it may also belong within the orbit of horned divinity. What look at first like exaggerated ears may in fact be spiral ram horns rendered in a flattened and symbolic manner. If that reading is right, then the figure stands even closer to the horned gods known from Roman Britain, where ram horns, especially in stylized form, appear again and again. Several later Irish carvings, though certainly Christian in date, also seem to preserve the old image in altered form. On the high cross at Clonmacnoise, there is a crouching horned figure with a face that strongly recalls the famous antlered god of the Gundestrup cauldron. The legs are folded beneath it in a twisted, interlaced version of the old squatting pose. Worn antlers still seem to rise from the head, and serpentine forms coil around the figure. This is no ordinary saint, monk, or biblical character. It looks like a pagan divine type pressed into Christian symbolism, perhaps reinterpreted as Satan or as a general embodiment of hostile spiritual force. Another horned and crouching figure appears on the pillar at Carndona. A simpler but still recognisable version may survive on a standing stone at Tara. And on a bucket from Ireland, found in a Viking ship burial in Norway, there appears yet another squatting figure with the same gaunt face and compressed body, clearly descending from the same visual ancestry. These examples are late, but they matter precisely because they show how hard it was to erase the old form. The image endured even after its meaning had been reversed. If the carved evidence suggests the god's presence in Ireland, the literature offers faint but valuable support. The texts are even more hesitant than the carvings, and most references are buried in sources that mix folklore, onomastic explanation, and mythic fragments. Still, a few names and episodes are hard to dismiss. One hero is called Furbade, the Horned, and another is remembered as horn-bearing in a martial context. On their own, such references prove very little, but they become more meaningful when placed alongside the wider iconographic pattern and the known Celtic tendency to preserve divine traits within heroic or semi-historical figures. The most intriguing literary case, however, is not a clearly horned man at all, but Conall Cernach, one of the great warrior heroes of Irish tradition. His epithet is usually translated in a way that emphasises victory, yet the older resonances of the name, together with his role, make the figure more complex than that. Conall is not just a warrior, he is an ancestral figure, a boundary guardian, a roaming champion, and one of the great head-takers of Irish story. Those are already the sorts of features that often cling to reduced or euhemerized divinities. More importantly, a strange and very early tale places him in a setting that seems to preserve elements of the older stag god's world. In that story, he travels overseas with another heroic figure to recover stolen cattle, a wife, and sons from a dangerous fortress in the Alpine region. Before reaching the stronghold, the heroes are warned by women of the land that the most terrible thing guarding it is not the warriors within, but a mighty serpent. The serpent is dreaded more than the armed defenders. It protects the place, destroys many who come near, and is treated as the real supernatural power at the heart of the fortress. A prophecy is then spoken that Conall will destroy the place. Yet when the moment comes, the serpent does not attack him. Instead, it slips into his belt, remains there harmlessly while he storms the fort, and is later released without injury to either side. At first sight, the episode feels baffling, even absurd. But viewed against the wider Celtic background, it becomes highly suggestive. The horned god is regularly accompanied by the ram-headed serpent. The serpent is not his enemy, but his attribute, companion, or second form. It guards treasure, wealth, or sacred power, and the horned god himself has strong links both to war and to abundance. That matters because the serpent in Celtic religion is not merely a creature of terror, it is also a guardian of treasure and prosperity. The antlered god of Gaul is sometimes shown with purses spilling coins or with emblems of wealth beside him. His animals, especially the stag and the serpent, can participate in that same symbolism. In one relief, a stag is linked directly with money. In another, the god pours out wealth. Underground treasure, hidden riches, and the underworld itself were all naturally associated with the serpent. a creature that moved through Earth, emerged from hidden places and carried an aura of both danger and secret abundance. In Roman terms, such a god could even be compared to powers of the underworld and buried wealth. That helps explain why the serpent in the Irish tale guards both a fortress and its treasure, and why it does not destroy Conall. If Conall has absorbed traits of an older divine figure, then the serpent is not confronting its enemy, but recognizing its lord. The apparently strange anti-climax begins to make sense. The serpent slides into Conall's belt because the two belong together. What looks like submission may in fact preserve the old religious idea of harmony between the horned warrior ancestor and his serpent familiar. Once that possibility is seen, the episode stops being awkward and starts to look like a fragment of an earlier myth. Irish tradition elsewhere retains faint memories of destructive serpents tied to sacred power. Though later legend famously insists the island had no snakes, early material preserves hints of monstrous and threatening serpents that devastate cattle, destroy land, or are hidden within the bodies of supernatural beings. In one tradition, serpents are found in the hearts of a slain monster, and only neutralized by divine or magical intervention. In another, a serpent attacks a warrior god, but is itself brought under control. These stories are broken and often reframed, but they point toward a world in which the serpent still had sacred significance, not simply demonic status. The same is true in Gaul and Britain, where the serpent belongs not only to the antlered god, but also to martial figures. On the Gundestrup cauldron, the ram-headed serpent is shown with the antlered god in one scene and leads armed warriors in another. In Gaulish reliefs, it accompanies a native Mars, sometimes beside a goddess. In Britain, the same symbol appears with martial deities in regions where both the cult of war gods and the cult of horned divinity are well attested. In other words, the serpent belongs not just to fertility, hidden wealth, and the earth, but also to battle and sacred protection. That combination fits the Conall story perfectly. He is a warrior, a taker of heads, a guardian of territories, and perhaps the diminished echo of an older, divine figure. The serpent that should have fought him instead enters his belt and goes with him. That is exactly the kind of strange, compressed act by which myth preserves what story no longer understands. In Gaul, the antlered god is almost never shown beside a female partner. He stands alone, complete in himself, surrounded by the signs of his own power. Britain follows much the same pattern. The stag, crowned god of the south, and the bull or ram, horned god of the north, are almost always represented without a consort. Yet, there are few rare exceptions that suggest the idea of a horned female divinity was not entirely unknown. One pottery fragment from Richborough shows the bust of a horned woman in low relief, her breasts marked in the simplest possible way, as if the artist wanted only to make her sex unmistakable, without softening the strangeness of the image. Another small bronze figure, probably from a Belgic background and perhaps brought from Gaul, shows a squatting antlered goddess, holding a dish in one hand and a horn of plenty in the other. These figures are isolated, but they matter because they show that the horned divine type was not absolutely limited to male form. Even so, horns remain overwhelmingly a masculine sign in Celtic religion, tied to potency, wilderness, war, and the raw authority of animal power. That helps explain why a figure in Welsh tradition, described as having hair like a stag and mistaken for a devil because of his terrifying appearance, may preserve the worn-down outline of an older horned cult being pushed into demonized form by a Christian imagination. Ireland preserves the problem in a different way. There, traces of a god similar to the stag god of Gaul are harder to isolate, not because they do not exist, but because dating the material is so difficult. In Britain, the Roman period gives a framework. In Ireland, The same archaic forms continue so long that a carving can look ancient, while belonging to a much later Christian world. Yet once the wider Celtic background is understood, the Irish pieces stop looking accidental. If a horned divine figure was so widespread across the Celtic world, and if other major pagan types survived in Irish literature under the disguise of heroes, ancestors, spirits, and fairy beings, it becomes very unlikely that this god alone vanished without leaving a mark. In fact, the opposite seems true. His traces survive in broken, disguised, and difficult forms, especially in the north, where several monuments of unmistakably pagan character point to a religious centre in the region, between Armagh and Lough Erne. One figure from that zone, found near Newry and now preserved at Armagh, is especially important. It is small, rigid and awkward in shape, with a head far too large for the body, shortened limbs, and a mouth open beneath a moustache as if the figure were caught in some permanent cry or revelation. Most revealing of all are the small but definite horns rising from the head. The image is crude, but its meaning is not. It belongs to the same broad world of horned cult figures, known elsewhere in Celtic Europe. A second figure from Boa Island strengthens that impression. Its body is reduced almost to a support for the head, and the overall design is flat, compressed, and strongly reminiscent of the old Celtic habit of treating the divine figure less as an anatomical body than as a sacred sign. The pose below hints at the old crouching posture so often associated with the antlered god, and even if damage and later interference have obscured some features, the monument still feels part of the same ancient current. Another Irish head from Armagh may also belong here. What can be read as unusually large ears may in fact be stylized ram horns. That possibility matters because it would connect the figure directly with the horned god traditions of Britain, where ram horns, bull horns, and antlers are all used to express related divine qualities. Later, Christian monuments in Ireland seem to preserve the type in altered and more hostile form. A figure on the pillar at Clonmacnoise, crouching, horned, and coiled about by serpentine forms, looks very much like a transformed version of the old antlered Lord of Beasts. Another appears at Carndonna, and a related crouching figure survives on an Irish bucket found far away in a Viking burial. These are no longer straightforward pagan cult images. By then, the Church had almost certainly forced such figures into the symbolic service of evil, using the old god as a model for Satan or for hostile forces outside salvation. But the survival of the form still tells its own story. The old image was too deeply rooted to disappear. The literary evidence from Ireland is thinner and more cautious, but even there, the old horned divine type may survive in disguise. Some named figures are described as horn-bearing, and though the references are brief, they suggest that horned beings still had a place in narrative tradition. The most suggestive case, however, may not be a clearly horned character at all, but one of the great heroic ancestors of Irish legend, Conall Cernach. He is more than a warrior. He stands as an ancestral figure for whole peoples, a taker of heads, a boundary guardian, and a roving champion whose role often feels larger than the life of a human hero. That matters because divine traits in Irish tradition are very often hidden inside exactly such half-historical, half-mythic figures. One tale in particular contains an episode so strange that it becomes intelligible only when set beside the horned god and his serpent. In that story, Conall travels with another hero to recover stolen cattle, a captive woman, and children from a dangerous stronghold in the Alpine lands. Before they attack, they are warned that the greatest terror guarding the fort is not the armed men within, but a mighty serpent. It is feared above all else. Yet when the moment comes, the serpent does not strike Conall down. Instead, it slips into his belt and remains there harmlessly while he destroys the fort and carries off its treasures. At first glance, the scene feels absurd, almost broken. But in the iconography of the Celtic world, the antlered god is repeatedly shown with the great ram-headed serpent wound about him, held in his hands or rising beside him. The serpent is not his enemy. It is his attribute, his companion, and perhaps a second expression of his own power. Once that background is remembered, the Irish tale changes completely. The serpent does not fail to act. It recognizes its proper master. That reading becomes even stronger when the serpent is considered not only as a symbol of danger, but as a guardian of wealth. In Gaul, the antlered god is closely connected with treasure, stored riches, and abundance. He may pour coins from a purse or stand beside animals linked with plenty. In the wider mythic imagination of Europe, serpents and dragon-like beings often guard hidden treasure, especially underground treasure. The underworld, stored wealth, and chthonic fertility are all part of the same symbolic territory. In the Irish tale, the serpent guards a fortress full of what has been stolen, including cattle and precious possessions. Its submission to Conall begins to look less like an anticlimax and more like the last blurred echo of a cult story in which a great divine serpent belongs properly to a horned warrior ancestor. That possibility does not stand alone. Elsewhere in Irish tradition there are fragments of dangerous serpents, cattle, threatening monsters, and hidden powers in ways that strongly suggest a once meaningful serpent symbolism, later broken by Christian suppression. If the old god and his serpent were especially offensive to ecclesiastical thought, that would explain why the traces are so scattered, confusing, and often embedded in stories that no longer understand their own symbolism. The same complexity appears in Britain, especially in the north. There, the horned divine type develops in a form that is not identical with the southern stag god, but clearly related to the same broad religious current. In some places, the horned figure is closer to Mercury, in others to Mars, in others to Silvanus. But these are only Roman masks placed over local divine identities. In essence, what emerges is a regional, horned, war and fertility god, especially at home among pastoral and martial communities. One of the most revealing pieces is the ram-horned head from Netherby. It is forceful, severe, and clearly not a portrait. The narrowed eyes, the set mouth, and the downward sweeping horns give it the presence of a tribal guardian rather than a decorative image. It is easy to imagine such a head as the divine face of a people who measured wealth in cattle and needed strength against enemies on every frontier. A similar spirit runs through the horned warrior reliefs, from Maryport, Berg by Sands, and other northern sites. These figures are naked or lightly clad, armed, vigorous, and often phallic, combining warlike aggression with raw fertility. The phallus is not incidental. It makes plain that the god's power is not only destructive but generative. He defends the people and ensures their increase. In some cases, this horned warrior becomes a local Mars. In others, he takes on the features of Mercury, especially where the god of roads, commerce and livestock could easily merge with a native horned protector of herds. A few figures carry objects that suggest the caduceus or purse, though the style remains unmistakably local. Elsewhere, the horned god appears in more rustic form, closer to Silvanus, patron of woodland and hunting. In that version he may stand naked with one foot raised on rock, or hold a small animal as an offering. Such figures are especially at home in the eastern region of the Wall, where forests, hunting, and wild land remained important. There too the local god Cosidius sometimes moves between Mars and Silvanus. which shows how fluid these identifications could be. The same native power could wear several Roman names without losing its character. At times, the horned god is reduced to a head alone, and that brings the whole matter back to the cult of the head itself. In Celtic religion, the head was already the supreme sign of life force, divinity, and supernatural presence. To show the horned god only as a head was not a reduction in power, but a concentration of it. Horned heads from Netherby, Carvorin, Chesters, Corbridge, and other sites reveal how closely the two cults overlap. The horned warrior, the guardian head, the fertility symbol, and the divine protector all merge into one image. In a world where enemies were decapitated and heads preserved, a horned divine head was among the strongest sacred signs imaginable. All this points toward a broad pattern. On one side stands the antlered god, known from Gaul in clear form and probably carried into southern Britain through Belgic channels, though, perhaps finding there, local cults already prepared to receive him. On the other stands the northern horned god, more ram or bull horned than antlered, more obviously martial and pastoral, but still sharing many of the same deeper qualities. The serpent may belong to both. Wealth and fertility belong to both. Animal mastery belongs to both. The difference is real, but it is not absolute. Celtic religion is too fluid for that. The same divine type can shift shape from region to region and still remain recognizably itself. That fluidity may help explain the place of the great supernatural bull in Irish epic. The brown bull of Cwalnge stands at the centre of one of the greatest Irish tales, and he is far more than an animal. He is a being of wonder, almost divine in scale, strength, and presence. He shelters warriors beneath his shadow, drives cattle into fertility by the force of his own nature, fills the land with music through his lowing, and acts as a focus of tribal rivalry, wealth, and prestige. In a cattle-based society, such a being is not merely a marvellous beast. He is the divine animal form of all the powers the horned god represented. Increase, virility, tribal prosperity, danger, and kingship over herds. The more the horned god of Britain is understood, the easier it becomes to see why a heroic pastoral society in Ireland would place such a creature at the centre of its epic imagination. The persistence of horned imagery into Christian times also reveals how deeply rooted the cult must once have been. The antlered, squatting figure becomes an image of evil. The horned, pastoral guardian becomes a demonized force, yet the Church did not invent these forms. It inherited them and turned them against themselves. That alone says how powerful they must once have been. A harmless or insignificant pagan image would not need to be remade as Satan. Only a figure that still held imaginative force would be worth such effort. The same is true in Ireland, where direct written evidence is sparse, but the carvings, heroic fragments, horned monsters, and crouching devils show that the old god never vanished cleanly. He was buried, disguised, and recast, but not erased. So the horned god of the Celtic world should not be imagined as one neatly named and fixed deity. He is better understood as a powerful divine type with local faces and local names. In the south, he may appear close to the Gaulish antlered lord, seated among beasts, serpent-bearing, wealthy, and chthonic. In the north, he emerges as a tribal war and fertility god, ram or bull, horned, armed, phallic, pastoral, and protective. In Ireland, he survives in more elusive ways, as a broken echo in story, as a carved figure on Christian stone, as a horned ancestor or demonized beast. Yet everywhere the same core ideas persist. Power over animals, guardianship of wealth, intimate connection with fertility, and the force to defend a people in war. That is why Roman soldiers in Britain, whatever gods they had brought with them, would have had every reason to respect the local horned god of the land they now occupied. To offend such a being in a frontier world of forests, herds, raiders, and uncertain loyalties would have seemed unwise in the extreme. It was safer to call him Mars, or Mercury, or Silvanus, and leave offerings in the proper place. Underneath the Roman names, the old Celtic power remained what it had always been: horned, dangerous, fertile, and impossible to ignore.